Hello, and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through a Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brenda Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 110th episode of the Nauticast titled The Webs We Weave, an analysis of A Clash of Kings Tyrion 8, in which the Lannister small council absorbs the news of Renly's death and starts finding ways they can benefit. God damn it, they're traitors, all of them, just like Renly.
There's such a ghoulish tone to this chapter that I love, where it's like they're like peering at Renly's corpse and seeing what they can grab away from him and steal from his body before rigor mortis sets in. It's just, it's awful, and I love it.
I can see why you would love that very, very much. So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Sir Keith J, Master of Whispers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman and Mistress of Whispers, Lord Micah, Warden of the West and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gym that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant to the Hand of the King, Lady Zena of Valyrian, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, Ward of the East and Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorsadelica, Prince Matthew of House Targaryen, Proud Soy Boy of Summerhall, Defender of the Fifth Book, and Swing Dancer with Dragons, Sir K.W. Dent, Elsie of the Blackwood Guard, and Batman of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Geladems, Lord Quint Esquire, Master of Absolutely Positively not serving as a spy for several unnamed High Lords and Ladies in order to further the secret Black Fire-style conspiracy to overthrow the oppressive small council. However, the waiter for Tiwau, A.A. Ron, Damp-Hair, Prophet of the Forsaken, and High Priest of Euron Crow's-Eye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneris of House Colgarian, the First for Name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Overworked, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser of the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee of the Great Game of Thrones, Portress of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Blender Paints, and Maker of Drawings, Shawnmal the Slayer, Lord Adam T, Lady Alexandra of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logus, Bloody Scorpion of the Redfield, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse-Faced Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, Lady Ashley, Lady Raj, Mistress Horse, and our two newest members of the Small Council. You heard that right? Two newest members of the Small Council. The Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, and Marshall Harrison, absent, Shipwrecked, and the Jade Sea. He is going to determine a title later on, but I love that one as a good start. Well, thank you to all of our counselors, and welcome to our two new ones.
Thank you, as always, to all our counselors, and welcome to our two new ones. The names just get more and more metal and badass as we go. Can't wait to hear more.
And our spoiler warning, as we say on all episodes, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds of Winter sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Kaboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, are not brand new, but recently declared High Lord. And this question is a really great one. We're going to split into 2 parts, one for this week and one for next week. I came to Jeff's writing more from the meta perspective. The simple idea that you can't hold George to a publishing deadline because his payments from HBO greatly exceed what his payout from books would be was fascinating and honestly refreshing. Just not something I had thought of before. I'm somewhat fascinated by the division of Feast and Dance and its ability to follow the normal story arc, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and finally resolution. I understand in the multi-book series you won't have an overall climax, falling action, and resolution, but in each previous book, you have had those elements. But getting back to the multi-part question, here we go. I now regard Feast and Dance as my favorite books, but only after I read the combined reading list. So what are both of your opinions on the reading list? I believe that the dislike of Feast and Dance basically comes from the inability to reach the peak or climax of the narrative arc of the book, and had the Battle of Fire and the Battle of Ice been included, it would have changed the fan perspective on the 2 books. And what do you think? Could this have changed the perspective on the books? That's a great, again, just the beginning to the question there. So thank you so much. And what do you make of that, Jeff, in terms of the overall structure of Feast and Dance? What do you think of the, reading them in a combined order so that, all characters are sharing their chronology? And what do you think about, if the Battle of Fire and Battle of Ice had been in there?
So I'm that asshole who did not
you just stop it right there. Hell.
Just and again, there's my answer right there. No, I'm that asshole who, when I first read Feast and Dance, I read it in the published order, and I came away feeling unsatisfied with the Feast for Crows, specifically because It didn't have Tyrion, Dany, or Jon, the three major characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. And it had all these other characters. It had, fucking Greyjoys and Dornishman and Arya. Yeah, I guess she was in there. She's fine, but she's in Bravo, so Bravo sucks. So what? So where am I going to get back to Dany, Tyrion, and Jon, the three main characters in A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, as it turns out, when my second read through, I read through with the combined reading order, and I enjoyed it a lot more to actually get Jon's perspective and Dany's perspective and Tyrion's perspective intermixed with those chapters from A Feast for Crows, which I did enjoy a lot more the second time through. However, now that we're, what is that, like 7 years after I did my actual second read of the books, I do think that there is something special about the published order of these books. And I think that you were the one who actually convinced me the most about why the published order as it stands is the better way to actually read these stories. Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, I think it's important to read them both. Not important. None of this is important. I think it's useful to read them both ways. I think you can see a lot of parallels by reading them together, and you can, not miss your favorite characters. On the other hand, that really lengthens the gap between certain characters. Like, Bran and Sansa only have 3 chapters to begin with, and now there's just like oceans of time in between. Now, having said that, like Sansa's chapters in Feast are really long, especially the last one I think is maybe the longest chapter in the series. So you could, it's enough material for a few chapters. But, so that feels to me like less like a singular reading experience, more like, a giant, like, Moby Dick ×2 kind of project. I think Feast works really well on its own, actually, in retrospect. I understand, of course, it's missing a lot of the main characters, but I think it's really focused on certain themes and certain outcomes from A Storm of Swords and the ripple effects. And I really like the stuff with like Euron, and not everybody does, but I really gravitate to it. Dance is my favorite book in the series, just sheerly for the quality of the content, chapter by chapter, scene by scene. I think it's the best. Structurally speaking, it is a mess. So I think it definitely benefits from actually having the two put together. And, again, I think that you can read them wonderfully both ways, but I think the combined reading order is really good for getting people on board if they just look at Feast or Dance and go, what is this?
Right.
So I think that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think like reading it through, like the first time you should read through, I've always told people that you should read it in the published order, and then your second time through, sure, use a combined order. Used Shanti Collins's Boiled Leather reading order, which he recently just he didn't revise it, but I think he rehosted it someplace new so people can find it more easily. I just saw him. He actually posted on Reddit for all places. Or one of the other the Feast Dance, the one I did with Game of Owns, which I'm blanking out on right now, which is terrible, right? My friends.
One episode you did with them?
Yeah, that was
the Brienne and Jaime one.
No. So I actually helped with their reading order when they actually created one back.
Oh, the reading one. Oh, yeah. I'd forgotten
Feast with Dragons, I think, or something like that. A Feast with Dragons, or something. Whatever the reading order is, it's really, really good. And I had a very small part to play with that. That was all mostly Zach and Hannah and a few other folks that were doing that. But that takes us to our second part of the question, which is about the dislike for the climaxes for Feast and Dance. So the question is, if we had included one or both of the battles of ice and battle of fire, would it have actually have made the book feel, would people have enjoyed it more? And I think we've talked about this a bit in the past, but just to refresh people on like our opinion, I think is that of the two battles, the Battle of Fire is probably the one that might have done the narrative just a little bit more oomph in it. It may have made people appreciate Meereen a little bit more because he actually had a climax as opposed to a cliffhanger, which of course the Bys are flying into Meereen and Barristan's final chapter. And you're like, oh, what's going to happen? And you're like, oh, I'm actually on Dany 10. And then I'm on the epilogue and A Dance with Dragons is over. We talked about this and you talked about this specifically, but the Battle of Ice is just like one battle that's of a multi-part battle, which is going to take place. So if we got the Battle of Ice, it wouldn't necessarily be fulfilling because we wouldn't actually know what happens at Winterfell, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes we talk about the Battle of Ice as just, we use that phrase as just to stand in for the overall Northern campaign. But as that term has evolved from George's specific usage, it means Stannis versus, Hostine Frey or whoever else at that, the iced over lake at the Crofters Village. It's a shaping operation for Winterfell itself. Who knows what's going to happen there? Maybe it won't be a complete battle. That's why George is staging a Battle of Ice, because maybe it'll just be a coup of some kind or an ambush at Winterfell. But yeah, I don't think that necessarily would have, made Dance feel more complete in the reader's eye. I think the Battle of Fire might have helped a lot. For me personally in Meereen, I really liked Quentin's arc, and I really loved Dany's last chapter on the Dothraki Sea, so that made it feel kind of whole in character terms, even if not in direct, big picture armies plot terms. For the North, I think I really love the pink letter twist there in terms of wrapping
Yes.
things up. I think that connects the wall and the Winterfell stuff nicely and makes Jon kind of reckon with his decisions and, leads to some wonderfully fascinating speculation. I think there's definitely a case to be made that even if you can justify each of these cliffhanger endings, though, it's too many on the whole. I think that's a totally fair critique.
And I think too with the North, you also have, I think, Theon and Asha's storyline ending in A Dance of Dragons is just pitch perfect, where Theon shows up in Stannis' camp and remembers his name, and Asha's like, Theon is like, see, sister, this time you knew me, which is a callback to see, sister, this time I knew you, which is a callback to a chapter we did a few months ago, Theon 2 from A Clash of Kings, which is a beautiful, brilliant ending and just conclusion of that arc that goes back, almost 20 years, and it's just so emotional, and I love that so much. But I do agree. I think the northern endings are pretty good. I don't actually find Jon stabbing to be much of a cliffhanger at all, really. I find the actual cliffhangers actually being Marine and other places like that, as opposed to the north. I think George really wrapped the northern storylines up really, really well.
Yeah, completely agreed. So thank you, Kabath, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions here, we'll answer on the Notacast podcast. You're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over at patreon.com/NotacastASOIAF, where we have monthly bonus A Song of Ice and Fire and Fever Dream episodes, show notes, Q&A, and access to the Nota Slack for our 2 highest tiers. It's been a lot of fun to watch so many of you jumping in since we hit 900 patrons. Thank you so much. We're grateful to each and every one of you. And stay tuned. Next month, we start our multi-part series about my personal favorite chapter in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, if it counts, even though it's not published, The Forsaken.
Yes, it's going to be a lot of fun to get into that. We're actually going to start this multi-part analysis with a bit of background story about the Ironborn from A Feast for Crows, A Dance of Dragons, and maybe we'll sample a little bit of Theon and Victarion's chapters from The Winds of Winter, as well as to kind of get a broad picture of what is feeding into The Forsaken, which is going to be a whole lot of fun to do that full-out analysis. Man, I had to stop myself from actually starting the synopsis for The Forsaken today, because I'm very, very busy. But yeah, very, very excited about that one. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with Tyrion of House Lannister, he had persuaded Lancel to become his spy and crowed about having it all: the girl, the city, the power. Let's find out what happens to Tyrion in this synopsis of A Clash of Kings, Tyrion 8. Varys warms his hands over a brazier and reports that sadly, so sadly, Renly is dead. We are all very sad. Anyways, he was murdered, got his throat slit. Terrible tragedy for the realm. Anyways, who done it? Have you considered that too many answers are the same as no answer at all? My informers are not always as highly placed as we might like. When a king dies, fancies sprout like mushrooms in the dark. A groom says that Renly was slain by a knight of his own Rainbow Guard. A washerwoman claims Stannis stole through the heart of his brother's army with his magic sword. Several men-at-arms believe a woman did the fell deed, but cannot agree on which woman. A maid that Renly had spurned, claims one. A camp follower brought in to serve his pleasure on the eve of battle, says a second. The third ventures that it might have been the Lady Catelyn Stark. Thank you, Varys. Extremely helpful as always, Cersei doesn't say. Anyways, you want this small council to grow even smaller, or would you mind sharing some actual insight instead of your opinion about Fleetwood Mac's premiere album? Well, Varys would. He totally would. But there are too many rumors. Too many rumors are worse than not enough rumors at all. Cersei warns Varys that he's paid well for the truth, not for rumors. And by the way, did you hear me before when I was threatening to execute you? I'm making it explicit now. Here's me threatening you. Cersei basically says. Littlefinger puts in that the small council would be great if it was just a little smaller, but Varys jokes. Yeah, jokes. That Littlefinger would be next on Tyrion's list. Varys then jokes back. Yeah, they're always joking, these guys. That Littlefinger and him might end up on the wall together. You never know. They're joking. They're bros. They're not. Anyways, now that the joking is done, Cersei decides to threaten Varys with being sent to the wall. Wait, so it's not a joke now? Bro, not cool. Littlefinger asks if Renly's death is a ruse, but no, it's not a ruse. Renly is very, very dead. We're all sad. So sad. Joffrey is going to be disappointed, Tyrion finally puts in. He had a spike meant for Renly's head. But whoever did the deed, we must assume Stannis was behind it. The gain is clearly his. Tyrion did not like this news. He had counted on the brothers Baratheon decimating each other in bloody battle. But Tyrion is good, guys. Totally good. Anyways, what's up with Renly's army? Well, bad news, friends. Most of Renly's army bent the knee to Stannis, with the noble houses of Florent leading the way. Ah, but wait, Varys. You said most. Not everyone? Nope. Not everyone. Randall Tarley and Mathis Rowan ran away like Robert E. Lee cosplayers that they are, and Sir Courtney Penrose, who, by the way, is a villain, is still holding Storm's End. Also, Renly's corpse has gone missing. Very unrelated, extremely unrelated, but Loras Tyrell has fled with the fifth of the knights who showed up to Storm's End. And yes, he may have murdered 3 guys on his way out in the Stormlands, but it's okay. It's only Robert Royce, Eamon Kai, and some rando probable peasant after all. No big deal. Sir Loras is likely making for Bitterbridge, Varys went on. His sister's there, Renly's queen, as well as many great soldiers who suddenly find themselves as kingless. Which side will they take now? A ticklish question. Many serve the lords who remained at Storm's End, and those lords now belong to Stannis. Tyrion leaned forward. There was a chance here, it seems to me. Win Loras Tyrell to our cause, and Lord Mace Tyrell and his bannermen might join us as well. They may have sworn their swords to Stannis for the moment, yet they cannot love the man, or they would have been his from the start. Is their love for us any greater? Asked Cersei. Scarcely, Tyrion said. They loved Renly clearly, but Renly is slain. Perhaps if we give them good and sufficient reasons to prefer Joffrey to Stannis, if we move quickly. And what would these reasons be? Well, Littlefinger immediately blurts out that they should bribe the Tyrells to join their side, but Varys is like, nobles are so above bribery, my friend. They're not chickens to be bought in the market. No, sir. Littlefinger counters to go look in the market and let the small council know how easy it is to buy a chicken these days. It's all extremely droll, and everyone is starving in King's Landing. Anyways, it's not like Littlefinger would go to Mace Tyrell and give him gold. That's fucking peasant behavior, bro. He will offer castles, honors, lands. It's no bribe. How dare you even suggest that, sir? It's a gift. Tyrion puts in that this probably is not going to work out for Mace Tyrell, but it might work for the lesser lords. Littlefinger suggests that the key to Mace Tyrell is Loras, Mace Tyrell's favorite son. And how are they going to accomplish that? Easy. They're going to pull up Renly and marry their asses together. Is that the right wording here? I don't know. I've only been married one time. Still I'm married, by the way. And who will be the blushing bride and dashing husband? Why, Marjorie Tyrell and Joffrey Faust Baratheon, Lannister. But Cersei objects. Joff is betrothed to Sansa Stark. Big fucking deal, Tyrion says. They'll just break the marriage contract. No deal. No big. Tyrion is good, guys. Anyways, Tyrion points out that Cersei might tell Joffrey that Marjorie is hot and ready to trot. But Cersei's all like, no 13-year-old boy cares about that shit. Exactly right, Cersei. 13-year-old boys are not about that. Oh, except for Tyrion. He got married at 13, as he reminds Cersei. Yeah, but Cersei says that shit was shameful. Joff is a fine-ass boy. Again, only according to Cersei in this narrative. Tyrion does that annoying thing where he starts to pointing out in his head that Joffrey is a monster, reminding the readers that Joff had Boros Blunt tear Sansa's dress off. And while there was a component of anger in the act, sexual sadism was truly behind it, Tyrion thinks. He and Varys had tried to figure out a good time to get Joffrey away from the Hound to go to Shataya's brothel, and I just want to pause here and say, Tyrion, what the fuck, man? Don't inflict Joffrey on sex workers. But Tyrion is good, guys. He's so good. Back in the present, Tyrion tells Cersei that they need to up and get into bed with the Tyrells or Joff ain't gonna live long enough to make his wedding. The Tyrells bring 50,000 swords to their side. Varys creeps on over and puts a powdered hand on Cersei's sleeve, telling her that Joffrey needs to put the needs of the realm before his own desires. Cersei, absolutely correct for once, tells Varys to get his fucking hands off of her and stop patronizing her. They don't know the shit women go through when they're told to, quote, put the needs of the realm first. Besides, Joffrey won't settle for Renly's widow. He won't consent. Tyrion shrugged. Oh, when the king comes of age in 3 years, he may give or withhold his consent as he pleases. Until then, you are his regent, Cersei, and I am his hand, and he will marry whomever we tell him to marry, leavings or no. Cersei's quiver was empty. Make your offer then, but God save you all if Joff does not like this girl. Well, that is now settled. Talk then turns about who should go to Bitterbridge to make the arrangements. They're definitely not going to send Bronn or Shaggy to do it, as hilarious as that mental image is. Cersei immediately suggests Sir Jacelyn Bywater, but Tyrion says no. Jacelyn's a good guy, but he won't make a good envoy. Okay, well, how about Tyrion then? Yeah, about that, no. Cersei should so totally go herself and arrange the marriage for her son. They bicker a bit. The Lannister siblings bicker for a bit, but then Lord Creepyfinger steps forward. Your Grace, my Lord Han, said Littlefinger, the king needs both of you here. Let me go in your stead. You? What gain does he see in this? Tyrion wondered. I am the king's counsel, yet not the king's blood, so I would make a poor hostage. I knew Sir Dolores passing well when he was here at court, and gave him no cause to mislike me. Mace Tyrell bears me no enmity that I know of, and I flatter myself that I am not unskilled in negotiation. Yeah, I kind of went from Irish to Scottish to like American all the same time. It's fine. I'm an American. I can do what I want. Not unskilled in negotiation is also a very rich way of Littlefinger saying that he, quote, bought off the Gold Cloaks to betray Ned Stark. I digress. but not for long. Tyrion realizes that Littlefinger has them in a bind. He wants to keep this enemy quite close to himself, but he really can't get out of King's Landing and allow Cersei to fuck everything up that he's been working on. Tyrion warns Baelish that there's fighting between King's Landing and Bitterbridge, plus Stannis will have his own men out to try and bring the Tyrells to his side. So Littlefinger wants an escort. Tyrion offers 100 gold cloaks, 500 gold cloaks. Littlefinger counters. 300 Tyrion sallies back. 340. The remaining 40 comprised of 20 knights and 20 squires. Littlefinger needs to look official. Tyrion agrees reluctantly, and Littlefinger asks that the two red wine boys, Horror and Slobber, which is hilarious that these nicknames have now, the small council know these nicknames that Sansa gave these kids, be included with him, as they'll need to return these kids to Pax Redwine as a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill. Yeah, love to see it. Cersei doesn't want to release these kids as Paxter is a, quote, traitor. Again, it's really rich what these Lannisters are doing at King's Landing. But Tyrion says they'll send Hopper back with Littlefinger and keep hold of Slobber and hope Paxter can puzzle out the meeting. But then Littlefinger gets back to business. He needs a lot of shit. I'm just going to bullet point his requirements for this mission because it's basically a list. He needs swift horses, lots of gold, a commission in writing signed by every small counselor, and Joffrey, the king himself. Tyrion uncomfortably agrees to everything, and Littlefinger says he'll be gone by the morning. Good. Get the fuck out, Littlefinger. Oh, wait, one more thing. Littlefinger wants a reward for his loyal service to the king. When Cersei asks what he wants, Littlefinger smiles slyly at Tyrion. Interesting. And says he'll think of something. Outside, the sky is foggy, and Tyrion wonders about whether it'll be a dangerous day to travel. But he orders Varys to draw up the papers and orders Joffrey to get woken up. Dude, the king is still sleeping? It's daytime, as my daughters like to say when they're jumping on me at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. Not mad. The small council breaks up, and Tyrion finds himself somewhat alone with Cersei, with Sir Preston Greenfield there putting on a cloth of silver cloak on Cersei's shoulders, and Bronn is also there too, probably creeping in the shadows. Cersei asks how the chain is going, and Tyrion replies that it's going great. Thank the gods for Sir Courtney delaying Stannis. But then Cersei puts on the charm offensive. Weird. Tyrion, I know we have not always agreed upon policy, but it seems to me that I was wrong about you. You were not so great a fool as I imagined. In truth, I realize now that you have been a great help. For that, I thank you. You must forgive me if I have spoken to you harshly in the past. Must I? Tyrion gave her a shrug, a smile. Sweet sister, you have done nothing that requires forgiveness. Today, you mean? They both laughed, and Tyrion leaned over, and Cersei leaned over and planted a quick, soft kiss on his brow. Too astonished for words, Tyrion could only watch her stride down the hall, Sir Preston at her side. Now alone with Bronn, Tyrion is at a loss of words, wondering if that really just happened. Cersei kissed him? Weird. Real weird. Bronn asks if it was sweet, and Tyrion says, no way, dude. I'm totally not into my sister. He totally is. The last time Cersei kissed Tyrion was when Tyrion was maybe 6, maybe 7 years old, and Cersei did it on a dare from Jaime. The woman's finally taken note of your charms, Bronn says. No, Tyrion says. No, the woman is hatching something. Best find out, Bronn. You know, I hate surprises. And that is Clash of Kings, Tyrion 8. Now, look, I'm not saying I don't miss our month of Catelyn already, but I am saying that this chapter is a nice grounded palate cleanser from Renly, at least, right? You know, love always for Catelyn, but now we're finally past Renly. Back to Tyrion. It's interesting. What did you think of this chapter, man?
Yeah, Tyrion 8 can't help but feel like a come down after spending so much time at Storm's End with the Baratheon bros, but it's a very appropriate kind of come down. A focused dialogue scene that filters the earth-shattering revelations of those Catelyn chapters through the wants and needs of the major players in court politics. Tyrion, Cersei, Littlefinger, Varys. This means something different to each of them, even as they are on the surface acting as a unit. Renly's death, a spiritual and metaphysical phenomenon in the moment, has now been absorbed back into the political community as a shadow on a wall, like anything else, given meaning by its audience.
I love that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that this chapter essentially works as an epilogue to those Storm's End chapters, and it's kind of like similar to what we see in. And we do get that in the form of like a rundown of what's actually happened at Storm's End. We get rumors of who did Renly in, and then we get Littlefinger heading for Bitterbridge to bring the Tyrells into alliance. I mean, that's basically our springboard for a lot of the political plot in King's Landing going forward. And I'm not just talking for a Clash of Kings. I'm talking past at least a Dance of Dragons, because some of this shit is not resolved yet by the end of a Dance of Dragons. And this is kind of like the same basic narrative structure that George used when he wrote the epilogue to A Dance of Dragons, which functions similar to this chapter in the narrative, with Kevin Lannister taking Tyrion Lannister's role and hearing about events in the Stormlands, absorbing the rumors that are flying around them about what is actually occurring in the South, and then Varys making his move, which will then drive a lot of the political action in King's Landing and the Stormlands come the Winds of Winter, as I was saying before. And I just love it. I love these like small, intimate, small council scenes. I just love the small council as a whole. I love whole chapters dedicated to the small council, to any shitty small council business. Hell, you could be talking about the tariffs being imposed by Gulltown traders floating their way down the narrow sea. I would read the shit out of that chapter. And I just love the small council specifically because it's the beating heart of Southern political Westeros. Love it.
You can see that absolute focus on the core of politics in this chapter. The opening shot, so to speak, of Tyrion VIII is a close-up of Varys' hands as he warms them over the fire while informing the rest of the small council of Renly's death. It makes me think of someone washing their hands. Specifically, in the wake of Renly's death, it makes me think of someone washing their hands of blood. Fire consumes. As Dany thinks, fire makes her clean. Can Stannis use R'hllor's fire to wash his hands clean of Renly's blood? And what about Varys? Will Dany's fire wash him clean of the blood on his hands as it strips the flesh from his bones?
There's also kind of like a fun continuity piece as well that George keeps sprinkling into the narrative in A Clash of Kings. The White Raven, as we find out from the prologue to A Clash of Kings, has arrived from the Citadel announcing the end of summer. And now, in this chapter, which is a little bit beyond the midpoint of Clash of Kings, a chill is starting to set in the South. The literal warm summer of the South that Robert boasted of to Ned, all those plums and all, everyone getting naked in the water and shit like that, all the great Robert stuff that he was all about, it's now fading away. But it's also the metaphorical warm sun of peace and plenty that was Robert Baratheon's fat reign, literal, metaphorical, is also fading, replaced by the cold winter of war, starvation, and death.
What was Renly's last word? Cold. And Varys is feeling that chill as well. For the moment, however, Varys' personal crimes and how he will suffer for them are on the back burner, so to speak. And we'll have a lot more to say about the spider's fears and desires in Tyrion 10 when he gives his big monologue about his backstory. The focus in this scene is on Renly's death and how it carries different implications and ripple effects for everyone in this room. Before we can explore those ripple effects, however, the counselors have to confront the reality of the death itself, surrounded as it is by a fog of confusion. Here we see something I was talking about a couple of weeks ago. Renly's death allows George to comment on modern political assassinations with which the reader will presumably be more familiar than medieval-era assassinations. As Varys says, when a king dies, fancies sprout like mushrooms in the dark. American readers will be all too familiar with this phenomenon. Just look at the fancies sprouting around the death of JFK, our very own young king with his own Camelot. Renly was killed by one of his guards, or by Catelyn, or by a woman he'd spurned. JFK was killed by the mob, or Castro, or by the CIA. We feel the need to understand and thus wield some measure of control over the major political and cultural events of our lives. We feel the need to all be detectives. And this is in part why the noir genre has aged so well. It might not be the Prohibition era anymore. We might not be gumshoes running around interrogating dames, but everyone understands the deep frustration of trying to solve the unsolvable. As readers, as audience members, we are detectives of a sort, trying to piece together the narrative fragments we glimpse into a single coherent whole. And we do that in large part because the sad reality is that in life, unlike art, you are never ever going to arrive at that coherent whole. Power will always, always stay a shadow on a wall. This tragic sense of entropy, this impotent paranoia that can only observe abuses of power but never change, nor even fully comprehend them, is the core of great modern detective stories from Chinatown through Inherent Vice and beyond. And like the detectives in those stories, Varys is able to gather significant intimate information about Renly's death. He knows that Renly's throat was slit and that his gorget didn't save him. So, someone who was on the scene works for Varys. It's a chilling reminder that in any given scene in A Song of Ice and Fire, you kind of have to assume that someone in the room works for Varys, because the spider weaves his webs everywhere.
Yeah, you're right about that. Those webs are extensive. But, you know, they sometimes get a little bit constrained by geography, right? Varys seemingly had informers in Stannis' camp at one point in time, but they all went silent when Stannis absconded to Dragonstone with the royal fleet and closed the port to anyone coming in and out of Dragonstone. So Varys really had no idea what Stannis was planning or doing until he landed in the Stormlands. And we should never forget that Varys' biggest intelligence failure, was finding out about Ned Stark's execution not beforehand, but actually on the steps of Baelor's Sept. Thank you, Littlefinger. Moreover, Varys really, as far as I could tell, this is just a theory, just a kind of an idea, Varys doesn't really seem to have any eyes inside the Tyrell camp at Bitterbridge, as he's unable to provide any real information on what the Tyrells are doing now. And this is just an extremely minor theory, but there really didn't seem to be much of a Tyrell Reach presence in King's Landing prior to the War of the Five Kings erupting. So my opinion, any of the spies that Varys recruited that then turn over information to Varys in this chapter that Varys reports were likely recruited from Renly's faction in King's Landing before Renly actually, GTFO'd instead of saving Ned Stark's life because he's a coward. And I'm glad he's gone. Overall, what I like about these theories of who killed Renly is how you start to see basically the historical foundations you were referring to with the assassinations of who actually, why there's be three explanations for one event. When the history book is written about Renly by the next Maester Yandel or Maester Gildain, I kind of wonder if they won't include theories about jealous lovers, guardsmen who've been bribed, Catelyn Stark doing the deed, or Stannis being behind everything. Kind of makes sense. But regardless of how the history remembers the deed, there's also something a little bit troubling. There's the distinct possibility that maybe Varys does have all this information in hand. Maybe he does have informers everywhere. And if he does, that's really, really much more insidious.
And as you say, it's the idea that he might have spies around every corner that matters most. That's more important than whether he actually does. It's relative power. It's power relative to everyone else in the room. And because no one else, not even Littlefinger, can match that spy network, they are all reliant on the information he chooses to give them, whether it's real or not, whether he knows if it's true or not. Meaning that Varys can not only control his own conspiracy, but influence everyone else's. All Cersei can do is complain that he doesn't know more. All Littlefinger can do is wonder if it's a ruse and take Varys' word that it isn't. Even Tyrion knows that he only knows what Varys wants him to know. Knowledge is power. It's Varys' armor. But Varys is also like those detectives in modern cynical noir stories in that all the information he gathers doesn't actually illuminate what happened or help decide what to do now. Evidence is supposed to be the lifeblood of both detective work and careful reading. But in this scene, George is showing us the limits of evidence. What happened to Renly is beyond the tools Varys is bringing to bear, not only because the Shadow Baby is a thing of occult, irrational magic, but also because it vanished, and the only witnesses to it had to immediately run for their lives. Now, Varys insists that he is limited by the social status of his spies. As we see in his report, Varys' spies tend to be grooms, washerwomen, men-at-arms. If he has lords and knights in his pocket, at least in this part of Westeros, he's not telling anybody about it. Yet it really doesn't make sense that this should limit Varys' ability to gather information. Flunkies and peons make better spies, as Dantos tells Sansa. I hear all sorts of things as a fool I never heard when I was a knight. They talk as though I am not there, and the spider pays in gold for any little trifle. I think Moon Boy's been his for years. Varys recruits among these folks for a reason. After all, how did Varys find out about Renly's slit throat and broken gorget? Because when Loras made off with the body, he presumably ordered some squires or grooms or men-at-arms to help him, and one of them worked for Varys. Varys' limitation is not the status of his spies. It is the nature, in this case, of the murder act itself, which was designed to throw off detection by leaving no evidence behind. And that is something Varys really doesn't want to admit, because that calls into question the very nature of his profession, not just his specific spy network. Renly's death makes all the schemers suddenly look powerless, and so Varys basically has to come up with a reason everyone should still be listening to him. Varys is right that too many answers are the same as none. But as Cersei points out, if that's the case, why trust Varys at all? Mm-hmm. What is he bringing to the table? Pycelle and Janos Slynt, after all, didn't bring enough to the table to justify their presence in this room any longer. And Varis and Littlefinger are joking with each other about, they have to do better. And it's interesting to question, okay, but so why are they just joking about it? Why are they not taking this seriously? Why are they not worried? Because both Varys and Littlefinger have come to the conclusion so far in the Clash of Kings that neither Cersei nor Tyrion really has the capacity to replace them. They're secure in their jobs. They have their larger plans cooking in the background. They're confident in the moment that the Lannisters can't or won't stop them. That's not really their concern.
And they haven't yet. And as Tyrion has that mandate when he comes down from the Riverlands from Tywin to execute any member of the small council that Tywin thought were acting against Lannister interests in King's Landing. Varys has been able to play Tyrion off. He's become Tyrion's best friend in King's Landing. He's helped him in many, many ways. So obviously he's pro Lannister, right? No, as Tyrion notes in Tyrion 6, he's much more subtle than a toady like Pycelle is, and the same for Littlefinger too. Littlefinger is the one that potentially had the most to lose from Tyrion coming to King's Landing, since he framed again, I don't want to yell this, but he framed Tyrion with the dagger for Bran's life back in a Game of Thrones, and he knows it. They both know each other. But there's also the strongest possibility, which I think leads to their job security, is that Varys and Littlefinger know there's a greater danger to all of their conspiracies, and the Lannisters know this too, that there's a greater danger than Littlefinger and Varys at the moment just over the horizon. Stannis. Okay, I'm done.
Exactly. Renly's death is a source of concern for Varys and Littlefinger, not because it will lead to an immediate loss of power, but because it might produce a loss of power down the line if Stannis becomes king, which is now much more likely. And the reason they don't want that to happen is that he despises both Varys and Littlefinger, and will probably get rid of them happily, even if it makes his job harder, which is the thing the Lannisters are not willing to do. Tyrion does not like or really trust Varys and Littlefinger, but he thinks, I can't get rid of them right now without making my job harder. And I'm up against Stannis, and I need them, and Varys and Littlefinger know exactly that's what's happening. Varys and Littlefinger need the Lannisters right now. The Lannisters need Varys and Littlefinger right now. Stannis is the boogeyman coming for all of them, and it kind of unites them all together. That's the ultimate takeaway from the news of Renly's death. Cersei is a very reactive politician, and she often allows her pride and anger to blind her to the true import of a given piece of information. As such, she is focusing here on who slit Renly's throat, and how useless Varys is if he can't tell her that specifically. But while Tyrion certainly has his own humongous blind spots, he is somewhat better at seeing the big picture and looking beyond his pride. He silently absorbs Varys' news, Littlefinger's jests, and Cersei's blind rage before cutting through it all to deliver the message that matters. Whoever did the deed, we must assume Stannis was behind it. The gain is clearly his. And this is the question you must always ask in politics. Qui bono? Who is benefiting? Who struck the blow as a distraction to keep everyone from asking the important question? Why? Why was Renly killed? Who benefited? Who had the power to cover it up? And the answer, as Tyrion recognizes, is Stannis. The gain is his. And as we see when we return to Storm's End in Davos 2, he has the power to cover it up. By the same token, the answer in the real world, the question we should ask about the assassination of JFK or any other political figure is not who fired the bullet, but why? Qui bono? Tyrion understands that the important takeaway here is that Stannis and Renly never had the battle he was hoping for. As the Lannisters have slid toward what seems like certain defeat throughout a Clash of Kings, the one bright spot for them has been the Baratheon bros turning on each other instead of the Lannisters, and now that's over. There's only one Baratheon left, and he's the one the Lannisters have all been afraid of the most this whole time. Tyrion feels his battle wound from the Green Fork flare up, because he knows he's going to have to fight again very soon.
We are building towards the inevitable climax that is the Battle of Blackwater and the Clash of Kings. And just a minor nit, but I love this idea of Tyrion having his very own Jon flexed his sword, burnt sword hand as a form of his throbbing elbow. Sadly, this is only going to come up one other time in the narrative. Again, it's just a nit on my part, but something I just want to point out. But I think I love this idea you're bringing up about Tyrion zeroing in on the key bono question in this chapter. I mean, consider that through all the confusion and conflicting stories, Tyrion can cut right through the heart of the matter and see that it was Stannis who was behind Renly's assassination, no matter the means of how it was actually done. Interestingly, and kind of sadly, for Tyrion, he's going to forget the key bono when another king dies, and all evidence then points to him. You're at fault, Tyrion, for Joffrey's death. In Storm, he's going to be unable to realize that the Tyrells had the most to benefit with a dead Joffrey and a living Tommen. This is a really fascinating wrinkle, I think, on George's part in characterizing Tyrion, in that he's so spot on with his observations of events that are external to himself. He can really plot out the trajectory of Westerosi politics really well, so long as personally to himself. As personally to himself, he has a seeming blindness and inability to see the plots and who is actually benefiting from his downfall. And this event, excuse me. The assassination of Joffrey and Tyrion's role in it is not the last time we're going to see that either, but I will save all of my thoughts about Made of More come a Clash of Kings Tyrion 14.
The flashlight can't shine on itself, and as good a political mind as Tyrion is, he's his own blind spot a lot of the time, especially because of how his backstory within his family has played out. But Tyrion is demonstrating his keen political mind relative to Cersei and Pycelle and Janos Slynt, etc., by zeroing in on the one piece of Varys' information that is useful, something they can act upon to save themselves from Stannis. What of Renly's host? Absent a legal claim, a political program, or an heir, Renly's source of power was his army, and now it's up for grabs. As Catelyn predicted right after Renly's death, most of Renly's cavalry, including many of the lords, has gone over banner and blade to Stannis, the last Baratheon standing. This makes political sense, not only because these lords are now lacking a king, but also because they can now climb a new ladder, advancing their positions, shuffling the musical chairs around a bit. By crossing the line first, Alistair Florent guarantees that his family will be the most prominent in the new coalition. Being Stannis' in-law doesn't hurt, of course. These lords weren't motivated by love of Renly nor hatred of Stannis, so much as a desire for power to be gained through Renly's rise. Now Renly's dead, and Stannis is still alive. His star was rising, offering them a chance to gain power through him instead. But not all of Renly's followers followed this logic. Tyrion immediately zeroes in on this opportunity. Most, but not all. As it turns out, Loras Tyrell did not bend the knee to Stannis. Now, unlike in the show, this is not because he blames Stannis for Renly's death. Book Loras blames Brienne. The show also had Littlefinger on hand at Storm's End to immediately propose that the Tyrells join the Lannister camp. This is not the case in the books. So it's not spelled out exactly in the books why Loras was unwilling to bend the knee to Stannis. Without the Lannister deal on the table yet, what was Loras' plan? In part, of course, Loras wasn't thinking rationally at all here. His lover, his other half, had just been murdered, and Loras himself had killed his comrades in his rage. So he fled the scene, riding back to the Reach, riding for home and family, a source of comfort, while he and they figured out what to do next. Those emotional considerations don't apply, or at least not to the same extent, for Mathis Rowan and Randall Tarley, who follow Loras back to the Reach rather than bending the knee to Stannis. And I think what motivates these guys is a recognition that they will not politically benefit under Stannis. If anything, they will suffer with him as king. Stannis has not forgotten which lords besieged him at Storm's End. At best, they'll be confirmed in their position and gain nothing more. At worst, they'll lose it all. And we might salute Stannis for his refusal to reduce politics to bribery and horse trading, but the flip side of that is how difficult it becomes to grow his coalition. The Tyrells and their closest allies slipping through Stannis' fingers at Storm's End winds up guaranteeing his defeat at the Battle of Blackwater. Now, why is that? Loras leaves Storm's End with only like 5,000 men, ironically the same size of Stannis' initial army. That's not enough to stop Stannis at King's Landing. The variable here, as Varys notes, is the gigantic infantry force Renly left behind at Bitterbridge. Catelyn thought that decision, leaving the infantry behind, might be Renly's doom, but it turns out to be Stannis' doom instead, because if Renly had brought them, they would now follow Stannis.
There's also like another interesting wrinkle in that the large force of infantry that's left behind is comprised interestingly, and that Varys notes that many served the lords who remained at Storm's End, and those lords now belong to Stannis. And of course, Varys says, that's a ticklish question. Oh, that's what's going to happen there? So among the 50,000 or so soldiers left behind, there's a large contingent of soldiers whose loyalty is to lords who have now sworn to Stannis. What becomes of those who are, and I'm going to use a military term here, OPCON, which is operational command to the Tyrells, but are ADCON, under administrative command or control by Stannis' lords? Well, Lord Randall Tarley, Lord Fuckface, provides the answer in A Clash of Kings, Tyrion 10. Lord Tarley has seized Renly's stores and put a great many to the sword, Florence chiefly. Now, it's likely that these men were all executed by Lord Fuckface after the Tyrells took the marriage deal with the Lannisters as proffered by Littlefinger, as we'll discuss later in this episode. Again, the chivalrous image of the Tyrells put forward is belied by their actual conduct out in the field. But consider that these soldiers have done nothing to earn their fate. They hadn't marched with Stannis. They hadn't turned cloak for Stannis at Storm's End. Their only fault was bearing the wrong sigil, being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'll admit this is kind of a weird comparison, but I think of these murdered men in the same and similar lens as the Riverlanders that Tywin and his goons terrorized before and during the War of the Five Kings. They never had it really coming. Wrong place, wrong time. Why is it always the innocents who suffer the most when you high lords play your Game of Thrones?
That's a great point. Usually we think about that line in terms of people who pledge to neither side and are simply, thrown into the abyss of the war by both sides, but it also applies to these men who were on one side and just had the unfortunate position of having their lords flip over when they weren't in the same place, and suddenly they're trapped by that loyalty, that oath they didn't even actually directly swear. Mm-hmm. They're in limbo, pledged to no one. And as Tyrion realizes, this presents the Lannisters with one last chance to stay in power. Win over Loras, and you win over Mace. Win over Mace, and you win his massive army. Mm-hmm. Tyrion is basically following in Renly's political footsteps here. The Lannister-Tyrell alliance completely changes the Game of Thrones. Without this alliance, the Lannisters would have lost everything. And it's Tyrion who makes this possible, for which he gets exactly 0 credit from his father in A Storm of Swords. Cersei once again takes a reactive stance here. All she can think to say is that the Tyrells and their cronies don't like the Lannisters. How can they become allies? As Tyrion says, the Tyrells don't have to like the Lannisters. They just have to hate them less than they hate Stannis. If the Lannisters can make it so, they win. That's a core concept of politics right there. You don't have to be someone's first choice to win. You just have to be the best choice available at the crucial moment. Or in a more brutal way, it's like that old joke about how if you and your friend are running away from a bear, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun your friend.
Well, I hope I got to get back into cardio for my own personal life. So in the event that we're actually running from a bear, that
I'm made of balsa wood, sir. Don't worry, you're fine. I'll try to negotiate with the bear in the form of slam poetry. I think you're going to be just fine.
Oh, I would love that. That's great. But I think that also speaks to something that is a core weakness of Lannister ambitions in A Song of Ice and Fire in total. They can gain short-term advantage and win today's battle while losing tomorrow's war. I mean, part of George's deft handling of the politics of Westeros, it shows us over and over again how the Lannisters are maximizing any advantage possible in order to squeak out a victory. But the Lannisters are never seemingly able to turn their short-term victories into long-term successes, precisely because they don't have a winning message of why to stick with them or a set of shared principles to coalesce around. I mean, sure, the Tyrells right now might hate Stannis more than the Lannisters, but the ideology of Joffrey, such as it is, means that the Tyrells are always open to a better deal. Tommen in A Storm of Swords, and who the fuck knows come the Winds of Winter and beyond. There's an irony in that the Tyrells present a dark mirror to Lannister ambitions in seeing Joffrey as the short-term means to a long-term political goal, putting Tyrell blood into the royal bloodline. Meanwhile, the Starks, who always have that thumb pressed against them in the narrative and lose even when they're winning, as Robb Stark is going to say in A Storm of Swords, they ultimately have the ability to come out on top because the Starks have their lone wolf dies, the pack survives ideology.
Look, here they are. It also negates the betrothal to Sansa, which is politically null at this point, as everyone points out. But it's also worth noting that this is Tyrion's first chapter after Sansa 3, in which Tyrion saw how hideously Joffrey is treating Sansa. This may be an attempt on Tyrion's part to direct Joffrey's wrath away from Sansa, trying to protect an innocent as he did in that earlier chapter. But as we said in our episode on Sansa 3, Tyrion's ability to, quote, do justice is continually hampered by the king, regime, and family to which he is tethered. Tyrion has not solved the problem of his king's sadism. He has simply redirected it towards the Tyrells in an effort to make it their problem instead of his. And they, of course, rather permanently solve that problem and frame Tyrion for Joffrey's death in the process, a spectacular rebound of fate that is both unjust and ironically appropriate. Marjorie, unlike Sansa, has protectors around her, and Joffrey, unlike Stannis, has no shadow assassins to outfox those protectors. They will come for him and claim his life. Tyrion unknowingly seals his hated nephew's fate and his own, all while doing his level best to save them from the man whose inheritance he knows they stole. This is the essence of not just tragedy in general, but specifically the tragedy of political power. We are being shown how even the Lannisters' best decisions, the decisions that guarantee their short-term survival, still contribute to the long-term destruction promised by the moments and choices that define them deep down. It's all kindling for the fire. But that's still to come. For now, this is a genuine political triumph for Tyrion, and like all political triumphs, it is built on marshalling the full extent of one's resources at the precise pressure point with perfect timing. That's all you need. It's that simple. It's that easy to win in politics. Tyrion has what the Tyrells need. A living, breathing sperm donor with a crown who is not named Stannis Baratheon. In return, all Tyrion asks is survival. Win-win. In practical terms, of course, what this actually amounts to is inviting the Tyrell to take over the royal court. And it's fascinating to remember on reread that Tyrion is not envisioning his father as a leading partner in this alliance. Now, that's how it plays out, of course. Littlefinger and the Tyrells link up with Tywin and ride to glory together in Stannis' ruin at the Blackwater. But in these initial planning stages, Tywin has been cut out of the loop entirely. That's kind of exhilarating from Tyrion's perspective. This is in large part because Tywin didn't give Tyrion much directive on diplomacy. He's been kind of left to his own devices to conduct diplomacy on the fly with the royal imprimatur. But when taken in context with the Martell alliance, which also gives away more than Tywin was willing to do, I wonder whether Tyrion isn't trying to undercut his father on some level, or at least trying to establish his own power base outside his father's control.
Yeah, it's a wonderful point. I absolutely agree. And it's something that Tyrion's been angling for since A Game of Thrones. I mean, remember him hiring the Mountain Clansmen as essentially his private army, and he uses them as his enforcement mechanism in King's Landing, so he has men that are loyal to him, not to Tywin. He has Bronn putting together a less than crack team of sellswords and ne'er-do-wells and is training them to augment his clansmen in the capital, as we discussed in earlier Tyrion chapters in the Clash of Kings. And to counter Littlefinger's flunky, he has Sir Jacelyn Bywater running the Gold Cloaks for now. Though whether Jacelyn is actually Tyrion's man or loyal to Varys is a question that I think is left unanswered in the Clash of Kings. It is something that Tyrion thinks about, whether he's actually loyal to Varys and he replaced one of whether he replaced Littlefinger's man with Varys' man. Setting up political institutions and alliances outside of Tywin is just another angle that Tyrion is using here. But the problem, and there's always a problem for Tyrion, is that in creating the Tyrell-Lannister marriage alliance and the Dornish-Lannister non-aggression pact, alliance, whatever you want to call it, he's using proxies to accomplish it. Joffrey and Myrcella in particular. And in the case of the Lannister-Tyrell marriage pact, Tyrion may have the IP for the ideas, but it's Littlefinger who he's going to delegate to work out all the details. And what that means in actuality is that come the end of A Clash of Kings, Tywin can seamlessly move into the political paradigm that Tyrion has established and hijack Tyrion's schemes as his own and run them in his own ridiculously fucked up way.
That's very true. Tyrion is building this car and then his father can swoop in and drive it. And that's in part just because that's how Tywin operates, but that's also Tyrion kind of digs his own grave in that regard. And regardless of his motivations, he is basically giving the Tyrells everything they could want, with the price of fighting Stannis, a man they were already predisposed to dislike and resist. So what's the catch for the Tyrells? As Tyrion will admit to himself, the problem is Joffrey. That's the catch. That's always the catch, and he can't get around it, try as he might. Joffrey is likely to screw this up. But Joffrey doesn't directly appear in this chapter. Cersei is the one Tyrion is having trouble with here, and her motivations are worth teasing out. She digs in her heels against Joffrey marrying Marjorie, despite the transparent fact that the Lannisters need this Tyrell alliance to have a prayer against Stannis. Now, Cersei just doesn't like any rivals for power, so that could explain what's happening here. But she also keeps shifting her explanation of her objection, why she's trying to keep Sansa as Joffrey's bride, even though there's really no reason to do that now. The common thread, I would argue, is the younger and more beautiful queen prophecy. Cersei believes she has neutralized that figure, as long as that figure is Sansa Stark. But now she sees that it might be Marjorie Tyrell, who is far more powerful and well protected than Sansa has been since her father's downfall. And while Cersei's paranoia ultimately works against her, she is not wrong to sense danger from the Tyrells. She is just wrong about what form it will take. And what a great irony that Cersei, who believes she has dedicated her life to protecting her children, doesn't even realize in this moment that Joffrey is now doomed.
I love that point you're making about that Tyrion, that Cersei is sourcing her concern back to the prophecies she received. Of course, interestingly, George had actually not written that prophecy. That came in a rewrite for A Feast for Crows, but it's something that could easily and seamlessly be reworked back into the narrative here. But I also think there's something else at work here, and that there's something deeply personal for Cersei in treating Joffrey like a method of payment to bring a great alliance into being. Does that sound familiar? It really should. Because Cersei herself was treated that way by Tywin all her life, with Lord Tywin first unsuccessfully trying to hitch Cersei and Rhaegar together, and then successfully marrying Cersei to Robert. Come Storm, Tywin is going to try this again with Cersei, considering matching her to Willis Tyrell, the cripple, or Oberyn Martell before she explodes her father that she's the queen regent, not a broodmare to be married off. And now evil Uncle Tyrion is playing the role of Tywin in A Clash of Kings, using Joffrey like a broodmare to make another alliance happen. My sense is that Cersei, as we kind of unpack it a little bit more, and we will, especially in A Feast for Crows, that Cersei considers Joffrey a full or at least partial extension of herself. So Tyrion's proposal here is particularly galling. It's happening again. Tywin Writ Small is selling Cersei off to be married in order to make a great alliance that'll bring Westeros together. And what did it mean for Cersei to be married to Robert Baratheon? Nothing good for her, nothing good for the realm.
You make great points. I think that's exactly what Cersei's arguments are. That's what her perspective is. But Tyrion is beating down every one of her arguments, and it's interesting to note how he does it. On the surface, he just deflects the question of Joffrey's desires, or indeed his agency at all. We're the adults, he says. He'll marry who we tell him to marry. And he's not wrong, as we'll see at the end of A Clash of Kings, when Joffrey publicly sets Sansa aside and vows to wed Margaery, despite his visible reluctance to do so. But because Tyrion is our POV, we have access to his thoughts, as well as his words, and his thoughts give us a more complicated and troubling picture. In truth, Tyrion is taking note of Joffrey's frustrated sadistic desires, and he's been planning on redirecting them even before the Tyrell marriage alliance. Tyrion's plan is to set Joffrey up with one of the sex workers at Shataya's, in the hopes that this will sweeten Joffrey, as he puts it, and maybe even make him grateful. In Season 3 of the show, we see in detail how this would probably play out if Joffrey were a few years older, hideously and lethally for the women involved. But even here, it's clear that Tyrion's plan is misguided, dangerous, and reflective of the traumas and blind spots that have brought the Lannisters to this point in the first place. Tyrion is taking no concern for what Joffrey might do to these women. Who's going to stop him? Or worse, what if they do try to stop him and they hurt him, or kill him, or he orders them all killed? Lots of variables here. Lots to go wrong. Tyrion cannot see that because of his own personal history with sex and sex workers, and how that is wrapped up with the brutal hierarchy at the heart of Tywin's vision of House Lannister, a hierarchy enforced in blood and misery. For Tyrion, sex with a sex worker is how you escape that. It's how you banish loneliness, alienation, self-loathing, and anger. A lot of that specifically comes from being a dwarf in a world that hates him for it. But it's also wrapped up in the one escape he ever had from that world, his marriage to Tysha, and how that escape was violently cut off. So it's the only way he can think of to manage Joffrey. There's something almost naive about how Tyrion thinks this will be all it takes to cure what ails his nephew.
Yeah,
it's the sweet lesson in contrast with Tywin's promised sharp lesson in A Storm of Swords. And I think both of them miss the point. Joffrey might be too far gone with that crown on his head for either honey or vinegar to do the trick here. Once again, Tyrion admits that all his plans rely on Joffrey being a child. But that won't be the case forever. What happens when Joffrey's an adult and unstoppable? But again, you have all these kind of questions that are just lingering for the long term. In the short term, all Tyrion needs is to get Cersei on board. And he gets some help in convincing her from Varis and Littlefinger. So what are their angles here? Why are they on board with this plan? Now, as I said, both of them just want to avoid Stannis sitting on the Iron Throne. But they also have other, more long-term and personal calculations at work. Littlefinger, as we see throughout this scene, is as obsessed with sex as Tyrion, which is also rooted in a loss to love, though much less brutally in Littlefinger's case. He can't stop himself from talking about how bettable Margaery is and how sweet Sansa's body is. Because he was denied Catelyn on the basis of his class, Littlefinger's political mindset is caught up in his frustrated sex drive. He cannot pry those two apart. We see that throughout the story. The Lannister-Tyrell marriage alliance will leave Sansa without a future husband, making her vulnerable to Littlefinger's predations in terms of both body and claim. Now, something interesting, I think, about the Stannis-Renly showdown is how little heterosexual, procreative, marriage-pact sex had to do with any of it. Renly's marriage is a shadow on a wall, and Stannis is notoriously disinterested in sex. His only sons are shadows with his face who vanish after they've killed. But now, with this marriage alliance, we are back in the domain of leveraging sexuality for power consolidation. We are in the domain of the big tracts of land from Monty Python that refer to both literal land and also breasts, because that's how the system of power works. You take, sexuality and you use it for land grabs. You use it for power. You use it for consolidation. Tyrion and Littlefinger want to lead Joffrey into the Tyrell alliance dick first by describing Margaery this way. And Cersei strongly objects to this. It's a psychologically revealing moment for her. Now, I don't think it's about objecting because she doesn't like seeing Margaery sexualized. Cersei very much does not give a damn about Margaery or any other woman for that matter. It's because of how things turned out with Robert and Jaime. And because of how things turned out with Robert and Jaime, Cersei can only accept male sexuality within the context of a power dynamic that she controls. We're going to see that very strongly with the Kettle Blacks after she becomes a POV in A Feast for Crows, but it also colors her view of Joffrey here in The Clash of Kings. Now, of course, Cersei generally blinds herself to all of Joffrey's misdeeds, but there is something specific at work when she denies him having a sexuality. Cersei cannot stand the idea of her perfect golden son having a sex drive, because that makes him like Robert, and her whole goal in life is that he be nothing like Robert. When Tywin grumbles at her after coming back to King's Landing, "I did not fight a war to seat Robert II on the Iron Throne. You gave me to understand the boy cared nothing for his father." And Cersei replies, "Why would he? Robert ignored him. He would have beat him if I'd allowed it. The brute you made me marry once hit the boy so hard he knocked out 2 of his baby teeth over some mischief with a cat." As we saw in Book 1, Renly and the Tyrells were trying to set up Marjorie as looking like Lyanna. Exactly the kind of girl Robert would be into, exactly the kind of girl who would lead Robert to indulge his hatred for Joffrey and Cersei. And now that very same Lyanna 2.0 is being dangled in front of Joffrey instead of Robert, like a carrot. Remember how Cersei said Robert whispered Lyanna in her ears on their wedding night? And now we have Lyanna 2.0 being offered to Joffrey? That's what a nightmare this alliance seems like to Cersei. But Tyrion and Littlefinger have her on the ropes in terms of their arguments, and then Varys slips in to help them, saying, "Oh, it must be done, my queen." So why is he propping up the Lannister regime this way? It's again worth emphasizing that Tywin, the really kind of dangerous Lannister from Varys' perspective, is not involved at this stage of the planning. Maybe Varys was hoping that Tywin would fall in battle or become politically marginalized after the Tyrells showed up to take over the court. I think it's safe to say, regardless, that well before a feast and dance, Varys was planning to set the Lannisters and Tyrells against one another after Stannis was dealt with. Do you think that's fair?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's also what Littlefinger wants too. I mean, beyond like the personal stuff, which is obviously very interested in Sansa for less than political reasons, as we're going to unpack in significant length in The Storm of Swords and A Feast for Crows and the Winds of Winter, Elaine chapter. Littlefinger, though, has set the Starks and Lannisters against each other in Game of Thrones for political reasons of avenging himself against Ned. Again, why Ned? But I guess he was the one that won Catelyn. That's why he's setting himself against her. But he's also using the chaos to rise above his station as Master of Coin, generally low-regarded small council position. Soon, Littlefinger is going to be angling for a higher position in Great Lordship, and he's only able to climb that high over the pile of a shitload of corpses that the War of the Five Kings creates. Again, a War of the Five Kings that Littlefinger essentially midwifed into existence. It's intriguing, too, to consider at this juncture of the story, that Littlefinger and Varys are at kind of cross purposes. They're kind of maybe not cross purposes is the wrong word, parallel purposes. Varys and Littlefinger want to forestall a strong warrior king from taking the Iron Throne in the form of Stannis. They both want Joffrey on the Iron Throne now, so as to have a weak monarch that they can undo with relative ease. They both want the Tyrell-Lannister alliance now to keep Stannis off the throne, and someday down the road, they plan to break up that alliance. I think that's for both, and they both are planning for this alliance to break up. And they'll leverage the ensuing chaos to boost their own vessels of power into positions of power. Littlefinger using Sansa to become queen of the north with, of course, him as king, because, of course, Littlefinger is going to be the king to Sansa's queen, and Varys using his prepared prince and young Grift to take the Iron Throne out from under the new Lannister-Tyrell regime.
They're both going wheels within wheels, several moves down the line, and they both have different short-term and long-term plans. And for this brief instance, they're kind of clarified in a similar position, even as, their plans are ultimately working at cross purposes. So we've established the what, this marriage pact. We've established the where, Bitterbridge. We have the why, save our skins, and the when, now if not sooner. So what's left in determining the plan here is the who. Who do we send? And again, we see how all political opportunities collapse back onto what the political community makes of them. Shadows on walls driven by fear and desire. For Tyrion and Cersei, the role of emissary to the Tyrells is a thankless task, poised to undo everything they've built up against the other so far in the book. More than in our comparatively bureaucratized and technologically advanced time, Tyrion and Cersei's personal presence is necessary for their power. And this is because their power comes from them going around and giving direct orders to people, and those orders being obeyed. The trappings of power are what give them power, everyone's belief that they're in charge. But things work somewhat differently for Littlefinger. He definitely leans on the trappings of power, but in a different way than the Lannisters. They want everyone to fear the snarling lion, to stand in awe and salute of its glittering golden mane. Littlefinger benefits from everyone ignoring the mockingbird. But the mockingbird plants its eggs in your nest, and you don't notice until it's too late. It's almost the opposite, also, of the shadow Varys is trying to cast. Varys wants to look big, omnipresent, the spider weaving his web around you and you don't even realize it. Littlefinger benefits from being a little underrated.
I think you're right. But it's more than just being underrated. Littlefinger also benefits from taking on lesser regarded roles and tasks to achieve power. As we find in a Game of Thrones, Robert scoffs at Littlefinger as a mere copper counter, and even Tyrion will be unable to really take advantage of his short tenure as Master of Coin in A Storm of Swords. This, I think, is precisely because of these men's status as noblemen who are above such tasks as counting coppers. Littlefinger's real genius, I think, is sensing an intellectual lack in his quote unquote betters, and then becoming the subject matter expert in that task. And now here, Littlefinger takes on the role of an emissary, ostensibly carrying the Lannister offer to Mace Tyrell. Tyrion, again, is a very smart guy, but he's at a total loss as to why Littlefinger would want to take on this role. And part of Tyrion's political brilliance is that he can play the traditional Game of Thrones much better than just about anyone, because he studied it. He studied history, politics, warfare, science, etc. And he's observed all these pursuits in practice. Tyrion's intellectual passions can all be classified as basically traditional Westerosi pursuits that a nobleman would definitely pursue. He just happens to be better studied than his forebears and his contemporaries. But Tyrion's blind spot is having the same class snobbery as those of his noble class. He's not about to stoop to learning a mercantile trade. That's work done by up-jump peasants, for lore's sake. And while Cersei will point out that Tyrion is a good talker, I mean, it's sort of true, but he's not precisely the diplomatic sort. More often than not, pissing off whoever he's talking to in numerous conversations that Tyrion has in the narrative. Enter Lord Littlefinger, former customs officer at Gulltown, current master of coin. He's the kind of guy that rubs two gold coins together and magic comes up with 4. He'll find a way to pay for Robert's lavish tourneys and lifestyle through deferred interest. Again, go back and listen to our episode on Game of Thrones Edit 4. We talked about this at significant length. And here's the kicker. All of those loan negotiations, all the economic interests that he's used the exchequer to buy the crown into, that mass system of corruption that he's created, it all means that Littlefinger is the perfect candidate to play emissary. And Littlefinger's demonstrated his diplomatic ability before when he got into the grubby negotiation weeds of turning Janos Slynt and the Gold Cloaks against Ned Stark in a Game of Thrones. Tyrion, I don't think he can see that Littlefinger, the diplomat, is running the same game he's run as Master of Coin, being really good at something that his betters, in quotation marks, don't like to do in order to betray his betters, the cause, their country, and his benefactors.
I think you got to the heart of it. It's just a different understanding of where his power comes from and what he can use his power as springboards for than the Lannisters are working with. Even though Tyrion kind of understands Littlefinger better than the rest of his family, it's just not quite enough. Littlefinger's power is achieved through people he never gives public orders to because he doesn't have to. They're his people. They have their jobs because of him. And their job is to just quietly ignore his corruption. When you think about like how the mobs ran casinos out in Vegas, and what kept getting them in trouble is when they would just send their goons directly in to stomp around and cause a scene and attract local police and press. And when it was humming along, when they were doing it smartly, what they were doing is you just send in a guy and everyone in the counting room just pretends he's not there while he takes an enormous amount of cash out of the safe and brings it back. That's all you got to do. While Littlefinger is rarely subtle in person, credit is due for understanding the importance of a light touch when it comes to systemic corruption. You don't want to have to go around all day directly hustling people on your 2 legs. You want everyone to know better than to screw you over in the first place. The mantra of corruption from the top down is, don't make me come down there. As such, Littlefinger can leave for weeks or even months at a time and be sure his system is humming along because it is built on omissions, on silence. That's his shadow on a wall. And as such, Littlefinger is free of the burdens that prevent Cersei and Tyrion from leaving the city. For him, this is a gigantic opportunity on multiple levels. And this is a great example of how Littlefinger gets a ball rolling without knowing precisely where it will lead, simply because he can sense literal and figurative profit on the wind. In the short term, this just gets Littlefinger out of the city. Stannis will be coming soon with fire and blood, and whatever happens next, Peter Baelish wants no part of it. That's why he holds out for as many guardians as possible. But he also holds out for a knightly tale, specifically, to make him look important to the Tyrells. Again, his political POV was forged in the rejection of his hand for Catelyn. He's very used to not looking important enough. And he wants a document making clear his power to making arrangements on behalf of the crown, signed by everyone on the council. And this is a blank slate for, well, anything he wants, basically. Coupled with as much gold as he can carry, Littlefinger has guaranteed both his survival if all goes to shit, and a dramatic rise in fortunes if all goes well. He wins either way. It is an impressive performance. We will talk about his larger plans later in the episode, but this is Littlefinger's big move in A Clash of Kings, and he plays it to the hilt.
And Littlefinger is quote unquote not unskilled at diplomacy, and he can use his legally binding powers, as you were referencing before, to do whatever he wants to do. I mean, consider that during his tenure as Master of Coin, Littlefinger ran a massive Ponzi scheme right under the noses of the most powerful people in Westeros. Now he's on his own, riding for Bitterbridge without even the shred of oversight hanging over top of him. And that's really key for Littlefinger's scheme here. He's entirely on his own, without a minder or Lannister toady to counteract him. And I think this is also a failure on Tyrion's part as acting hand of the king. Tyrion knows that he can't trust Littlefinger, but he sends him off with a, quote, do whatever the fuck he wants papers in hand. Of course, it's hard to imagine a person Tyrion might send who'd fully comprehend what Littlefinger is going to get up to in Bitterbridge, but maybe, just maybe send Sir Jacelyn Bywater to accompany Littlefinger to Bitterbridge. I mean, after the riot in Tyrion's 9th chapter, our next Tyrion chapter, Jacelyn will tell Tyrion about the word on the street, and which to me indicates that he's got his ear to the ground, he knows and senses the environment he's around, and he bluntly tells Tyrion the ground truth, even if Tyrion doesn't want to hear it. And at the very least, sending Sir Jacelyn Bywater away might save the poor man's life. You know, hypothetically, save his life. Not hypothetically. Or maybe, and I admit this is strange, but why not send Bronn with Littlefinger? Sure, Bronn's not some political supermind, but I'd wager that Bronn's low cunning would at least allow him to see that something is off with what Littlefinger does at Bitterbridge. So perhaps Jacelyn and Bronn with Littlefinger. So perhaps Jacelyn and Bronn return with Littlefinger and speak of their suspicion to Tyrion. And maybe when Tyrion is framed by the Tyrells and Littlefinger come a storm of swords, Tyrion, who again is quite intelligent, can put all the pieces together and figure out who was actually behind the attempt to frame him. Maybe.
It's just that perfect frustration where George, has to keep Littlefinger around because he's got plans for him, but, wants to torture us and have other characters get so close to realizing what he's up to and then just miss it. And then, instead, of course, Jacelyn Bywater dies at the Blackwater. Bronn ends up being kind of co-opted by Tywin, and Tywin himself has no interest in hearing from Tyrion on this or any other subject and just steamrolls ahead. And the chance to get rid of Littlefinger is missed once more. Now, of course, this chapter, as you can tell, is more concerned with plot than with character. But we are seeing George develop the central character dynamic of these Tyrion chapters in A Clash of Kings. His dysfunctional relationship with Cersei and how it ultimately dooms them both. Even when their interests align. Even when they are managing to work as a unit. Even when on the surface they are repairing their relationship and moving forward together at last. We get plenty of signs that it won't last. It'll fall apart worse than ever. Right after they agree on the marriage pact that will save both of their lives, Tyrion and Cersei go right back to trying to one-up each other by getting the other one to leave the city. It's not even the pretense of trust. And when there is the pretense of trust, as at chapter's end, it rings wildly false. Cersei apologizes to Tyrion, praises his efforts, even gives him a kiss. And the only way Tyrion can interpret this gesture is that Cersei must be planning something, must be trying to pull the wool over his eyes with sweetness. He's right, of course. But how tortured and sad it is that the Lannisters cannot even imagine sharing genuine emotions with each other. They cannot care for each other as a family should because of their personal backstories with each other and also because power has corrupted their family so thoroughly. Even as the Lannisters save themselves from the forces of destruction outside them, they are as helpless as ever before the forces of destruction from within.
That's well said, man, and I agree. And for me, it's a strange parallel, but I was rereading A Clash of Kings Davos 2, as one does, when Stannis spends a whole paragraph attempting to figure out what Renly meant by offering him that peach. And you had a wonderful soliloquy on this back when we were doing part 2 of Catelyn's 3rd chapter, and that there's a lot of meaning behind what Renly was doing here. But ultimately, for Stannis, it is a gesture that will vex the king into his grave. That kiss here in this chapter that Cersei gives Tyrion, it vexes him, essentially. It kind of fulfills the same narrative function that Renly's peach does. And it leaves Tyrion strangely unnerved and stuttering to Bronn about. This is not normal Tyrion that we're seeing at the end of this chapter. There's a lot going on here. Cersei is definitely plotting something, as we'll find out later in A Clash of Kings. But it's also getting under Tyrion's skin because, we should be honest, he wants Cersei sexually. It's not exactly subtext in A Clash of Kings. Tyrion essentially says as much in his 1st chapter and when he's alone with Cersei in the small council chambers. And Tyrion is going to make that horrifically explicit what he wants from Cersei come A Dance with Dragons. But there's even more at work here. Tyrion ties this act back to his childhood and how the last time that Cersei kissed him was when he was 6, maybe 7 years old. And Cersei did it on a dare from Jaime. And that memory has been burned to Tyrion's mind. I mean, 6 or 7, do you guys remember a lot of your memories from when you were 6 or 7? Not really. I don't remember many of them at all. To me, it speaks to how that same feeling that goes into Tyrion, that you were talking about, how Tyrion's regarding sex workers, that he can't imagine anyone truly loving him. It speaks to that same vein of truth that's in Tyrion. For Tyrion, a kiss, one of the most physically intimate things two people can do, is mockery or treachery. Tyrion can't fathom anyone kissing him or loving him in earnest. So when Cersei kisses him here, Tyrion senses or knows that it's a lie. As he says in his 1st chapter, "Fool," he thought to himself afterward, as they lay in the center of the sagging mattress amidst the rumpled sheets. "Will you never learn, dwarf? She's a whore, damn you. It's your coin she loves, not your cock. Remember, Tysha?" And as you were saying, Tyrion is going to be proved right yet again. The kiss that Cersei gives him was a cover for a conspiracy. Another kiss, another lie. That's heartbreaking, man. I think it's heartbreaking for Tyrion, a character I don't have a lot of sympathy for, but I can feel things for even a monster like Tyrion.
Mockery or treachery, as you said, and they become kind of united into one thing in his mind as we go forward, especially towards the end of A Storm of Swords and in A Dance with Dragons. Moving on now into foreshadowing and groundwork, Bronn will indeed find out what Cersei has cooking. A conspiracy with the Kettleblack brothers, who will be first mentioned in Tyrion's next chapter when we learn that he has brought their services in turn, of course.
Yes, this is one of those, like, it's probably the most minor conspiracy that we have in A Clash of Kings about these Kettleblacks. Like,
Sure.
I'd even not totally, but I'd totally not completely forgotten until you brought up the notes that the Kettleblacks are actually in A Clash of Kings. They fulfill a minor role of, spying on Tyrion. No, they're spying on Cersei. No, they're actually out for their own, as Littlefinger's going to be. They're quadruple agents, as there's going to be put together in A Storm of Swords, because they're actually bought by Littlefinger, and now they become part of Cersei's love triangle. Square? Is it a square by the time we get to A Feast for Crows?
Non-Euclidean geometry when it comes to Cersei's love life stuff. You can't even, philosophers have gone mad trying to plot that one out. But yeah, that's definitely going to be developed later. That's just a seed being planted right here.
Mm-hmm.
As we discussed in our Renly episode last week, we do learn in A Storm of Swords what happened to Renly's body. Loras buried it somewhere secret near Storm's End. Varys just drops that in passing. It's, again, very small kind of twist, but it's George kind of drops that here and pays it off later.
Yeah, I think this is something that George definitely had in mind for what happened to Renly's body when he was writing this chapter. And he brings it out really emotionally powerfully in A Storm of Swords when Jaime talks with Loras about what actually happened to Renly's body. It's cool. I think it's one of those nice touches, as we talked about in our Renly episode, that gives some emotional weight to Renly, and that those left behind are the ones that we can find Renly's legacy in the most, like Loras Tyrell, his lover and friend.
Yeah, well put. George also drops in a comparison between Wildfire and the Candlelight in Cersei's eyes, because, of course, she's going to be taking quite an interest in the substance going forward. Not just her, Tyrion as well, but Cersei has more of a, I don't know, shall we say, visceral kind of connection to Wildfire. It turns her on, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, she wants to fuck Wildfire, or she thinks she's Wildfire that is fucking. I mean, it's basically one of the two potentially. It's so many.
Hard to tell. It's like a David Cronenberg thing, where it's like, I don't know where the desire begins and the control ends. It's Again, Cersei's sexuality is a strange beast. We're gonna have an interesting time with those Feast for Crows chapters, because I love them with Cersei, but it's difficult to describe exactly what it's like with Cersei's POV. It doesn't break itself down to dry analysis very well, so we'll see how we do.
I'm thinking I'm going to get. I'm already planning right now for a few years ahead. I'm going to give you a number of these synopses so you can give the full Emmett treatment about just going into the paranoia and the silliness of these chapters. I think you'd be perfect.
Delightful. I'll just be like, like Baron Munchausen waving my sword drunkenly on stage as the theater collapses around me. It'll be wonderful.
It's all so good. So we have Littlefinger here as mentioning as being not frightened of shepherds, only of the sheep. And I think this might be a reference to him being the, quote, Lord of Sheepshit, as he tells Sansa in A Storm of Swords, a.k.a. the Lord of his current holdings in the Fingers. And he's given, this is great, he actually gave the name to his holdings here. He calls it the Dreer Fort. And his lands boast a small village, a hermit cave, and, of course, a massive flock of sheep.
Littlefinger always likes his sardonic references to, his childhood and where he came from, and that's his armor here. He likes to cover up his little stories about his origins. And yeah, it's quite a moment when we get to Sansa's 6th chapter in A Storm of Swords, and we get to kind of break that open a little bit and actually see where he came from. It's kind of intimate, but kind of not, because he never really lets go of the mask. That's Littlefinger for you. So we see mentioned here Courtney Penrose and his stubborn defiance holding Storm's End against Stannis. And this will come up again in Catelyn 5 when Edmure says we received a letter from Courtney Penrose. And that's when we specifically learn that Edric's Storm is becoming the sticking point. And then that all pays off in Davos too when we see Courtney Penrose. So it's a little threefold revelation of cueing us into this guy who was barely mentioned before, but now suddenly becomes briefly the center at Storm's End and all the operations there.
It's one of the most fun aspects of George's writing, that you can have like one character that suddenly just rises very high in the narrative, like a phoenix, and is very bright and very memorable. But people remember Courtney Penrose for having all of about 7 or 8 lines of dialogue, but they're all so memorable, despite him being a total villain, that they make people love this guy for reasons that we will get into at significant length come a Clash of Kings Davos 2.
Oh, we got so much to get into at length in the Clash of Kings Davos 2. It's a book of a chapter in itself. We also get another mention here of Tyrion's great chain. Cersei asks how it's, proceeding along. And George is continuing to strike the balance of keeping it in our heads without giving away what it's for. So the Blackwater lands as a surprise, but not a complete out-of-nowhere shock. It's that great balance where you want to build on information the audience has, but that we haven't quite put together in our heads yet before it happens.
See, here's my question to you about this. Do you think that Cersei knows what the chain is for at this point, and is being George intentionally keeps it from the reader's perspective, or is she still under this a mistaken assumption that this is a chain for Joffrey's wedding name day, as Tyrion talks about in, I think it's his 3rd chapter in the Clash of Kings?
The fact that she goes right from this into like, you've been a great help on policy, suggests that to me that she might have some inkling that it's actually for a battle, but maybe she thinks it's just supposed to keep out Stannis' fleet, which is also what Davos thinks when he shows up. Like, oh, if they have this, this little tower, this little chain, set up, why aren't they cutting off the entrance? And then realizes way too late, oh, it's a trap. So I don't know if Cersei has quite put all of that together. I don't think Tyrion feels the need to tell her, but I also think Tyrion probably doesn't feel the need to especially keep that from her either. It's one of those things where it's like, I think Tyrion's just working on his own track, but I think the bigger drive at work is George trying to balance that information in the reader's mind, which is such a delicate task.
And he does it really well. I agree. I think he does it a really good job, so that when the chain actually comes into action at the Battle of the Blackwater, it becomes such a memorable event from Davos' 3rd chapter in A Clash of Kings. Finally, for foreshadowing ground, we have hashtag Riot Watch. Yes, we've got Littlefinger here mentioning here how little food is available in the market these days. Once more reminding us that the city is basically a pressure cooker right before it blows sky high with the bread riots in Tyrion's 9th chapter, which that is probably my favorite Tyrion chapter in A Clash of Kings. We're going to have so much to say about this. I will make no promises whether it's going to be a 1-part or a 2-part episode, but yeah, it's a brilliant chapter that deconstructs so much of what's going on in King's Landing and lays the Lannisters bare and all of their corruption and what it actually means for all of the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are living under their fucking traitorous regime.
Perfectly said, and I totally agree. That is my favorite Tyrion chapter in The Clash of Kings. And it's the sickening sensation of all these people and all their concerns and anger and fear that Tyrion's been keeping just out of the corner of his eyes, suddenly crowding into the center of his eyes and demanding his attention. And it is terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And I love George doing the build-up for it. Mm-hmm. So going into our discussion portion of the episode, since Tyrion 8 plays host to Littlefinger's big move in The Clash of Kings, and since he's going to be spending a lot of time going forward off the page, but doing significant actions, we thought this would be a good time to trace as best we can how the Mockingbird's master plan evolves between this chapter and his next big move, namely the Purple Wedding.
Right. So this is an interesting spot to do this. So as we know from the narrative, Littlefinger is going to disappear completely from the narrative until Sansa's final chapter, where he dramatically reappears. Of course, he's already shown back up at the Battle of the Blackwater with the Tyrells and the Lannisters, being, of course, very, very far behind the actual vanguard of the battle itself. He doesn't want to get himself dirty, potentially in the battle itself, actually doing all the foul deeds that he's accomplished on behalf of the Lannisters. So let's trace a little bit of where Littlefinger has been so far in the narrative. He was a major part of A Game of Thrones, playing a big role in Ned and Catelyn's storyline specifically. But now here in A Clash of Kings, he's in a somewhat precarious position at the start of the book. He's helped turn Janos and the Gold Cloaks against Ned Stark in A Game of Thrones. But Tywin, at the end of A Game of Thrones, suspects Littlefinger of being a traitorous little fucker because he is a traitorous little fucker because he counsels Joffrey to execute Ned Stark, something we talked about in our analysis of Arya's 5th chapter in Game of Thrones. So then Tyrion arrives in King's Landing with a mandate from Tywin to sort out the true and the false counselors. But what's interesting about this is that, and this is, we talked about this when we were talking about our fears for Clash of Kings, some of the things we weren't super pleased about, is that Tyrion is never going to get to the point where he can actually be like, I need to remove this guy because he thinks he's so invaluable. It's because Tyrion shows up to King's Landing knowing that Littlefinger has lied to Catelyn about the Catspaw dagger and the owner, namely that Littlefinger has framed Tyrion for owning the dagger and setting the dagger against Bran Stark. And now Littlefinger knows that Tyrion knows, as we talked about in an earlier Tyrion chapter. But Tyrion feels like he can't touch Littlefinger given how valuable he is in keeping Joffrey on the Iron Throne. This, of course, doesn't prevent Tyrion from enacting his hat trick plot to find out who's informing on him to Cersei, which, of course, is always interesting about this Lannisters. The internal dynamics are often just being the focal point of conflict and stress in the Lannister storyline in A Clash of Kings instead of the external factors, which are the Baratheons and the Starks. Tyrion then offers, in that hat trick scheme, offers Littlefinger Harrenhal if he can deliver Lysa Arryn and the Veil to Joffrey. But it turns out, nope, that Harrenhal offer was false. Gotcha, buddy. Just a joke, just a prank, bro. Littlefinger is wounded that Tyrion manipulated him, which is just so delicious, man. I love that. And we talked about that significantly back in Tyrion's 6th chapter. And I think this is where Littlefinger started plotting something else, which, of course, I'll talk about when we get to A Clash of Kings Tyrion 14. But now here in this chapter, Littlefinger offers to go to Bitterbridge to negotiate the marriage of Joffrey to Margaery. Why? I think you put it really well above when you were talking about how Littlefinger is hoping to get out of Stannis' warpath. But he's also going to be rewarded for his actions if the scheme goes through, and he plans to make out whatever way. Even if the Lannisters lose the battle, he's going to survive somehow. But he's also an agent of chaos, which is a term that George R. R. Martin used in 2016 to describe Littlefinger, which, of course, was personally gratifying to me for reasons that I can talk about offline. Because Littlefinger is also using this diplomatic foray to sow seeds for future chaos. Littlefinger can both create the alliance as well as destroy it down the road. And I really, really think this is what was animating his thoughts as he rode to Bitterbridge and kind of pieced this conspiracy in his mind. Perhaps he didn't have all of the parameters determined now in A Clash of Kings Tyrion 8, but I'm sure by the time he got to Bitterbridge, he knew exactly what he was going to do.
Yeah, exactly right. He can both create the alliance and destroy it. He can build this pyramid out of dynamite and then hold on to the match, ready to light it all up. And this is one of the most crucial negotiations of power in the story, Littlefinger and the Tyrells at Bitterbridge, and we don't directly see it. We have only Littlefinger's word to go on, and he's not exactly reliable. The Tyrells and their allies, the Rowans, the Tarleys, the Oakhearts, have forsaken Stannis' campaign for good at this point. They have a larger army than he does, but there is no way politically to keep that army together if they remain on their own while Stannis takes the Iron Throne. Margaery's widowhood represents the sudden instability of her family's fortunes. The personal is political. Sex and power are so deeply intertwined they are hard to separate. They need a new king, and Margaery needs a new husband to produce the next king. These are one and the same concern, and Littlefinger walks into the room knowing that. It would seem his nightly tale did the trick of getting Littlefinger access to the central rosebush itself, Mace Tyrell, and more so his mother Olenna, who was born a Redwyne, and is probably the main reason Littlefinger wanted to take a Redwyne twin along. Olenna is a carefully kept secret from the reader until her introduction in A Storm of Swords. So again, it's difficult to establish what the dynamic was here. But Littlefinger must have known, I think it's fair to say, who he had to persuade and how. Loras on the romantics, Olenna on the logistics, and Mace in between. That's the Tyrells in a nutshell, and Littlefinger played each in turn Or so he says. Now, I don't think he's lying exactly. I think he did use both song and steel to get what he wanted, while convincing the Tyrells it was all their own idea and he but their humble servants. Or at least he convinced Mace Tyrell of that. He leveraged the romantic idea of the Kingsguard in stories, the image he fell in love with as a lad and now feels betrayed by, to ensure Loras joined the Kingsguard. Now, why do this? Much as Littlefinger, like the Tyrells themselves, and Varys too, prefers the Lannisters to Stannis in the short term, he does not want their power secured in the long term. So while on the surface, ensuring Loras' introduction to the Kingsguard binds the families together, gives Mace a useful role for his favorite son, as Littlefinger tells Sansa, what putting Loras in the Kingsguard actually does is put a hot-headed, violent young man in permanent close contact with the sadistic young king who is about to be married to the violent young man's sister. A recipe for disaster, and Littlefinger set that up deliberately. It's as if Sansa was married to Joffrey with Robb serving in the Kingsguard. Not everyone is Aemon the Dragon Knight, made to sniff back a perfectly manly tear in situations such as these. Littlefinger's brilliance here is ensuring the Tyrell-Lannister alliance persists in the short term while ensuring that it disintegrates in the long term. Yet, while I think Mace and Loras did get thoroughly worked over by the Mockingbird here, they just went along with his scheme without realizing that's what they were doing, Olenna immediately understood Littlefinger's ploy, and that's why she had to corroborate it all with Sansa. She knows her family needs a new king, but she realizes there must be a catch somewhere in here and that it's probably Joffrey. So her questions at Bitterbridge focus on not what the Lannisters and Tyrells have to offer one another, but on the potential seed of their mutual ruin that Littlefinger is carefully planting. Littlefinger responds by praising Joffrey, sticking to the party line, acting like a good Lannister emissary, publicly reassuring the Tyrells so they can all move forward. But under the surface, he has his men whisper the truth about Joffrey to the Tyrells' men so the Tyrells understand what's going on. Now again, why is Littlefinger doing this? Because he's probably reached the same conclusion as Bronn, that Joffrey has outlived his usefulness here, and that now he's just kind of getting in the way, and that Tommen, like a king should, will just do what everyone tells him to do. So what I just love about the Tyrell-Littlefinger negotiation at Bitterbridge is that in the guise of working out a marriage pact, what Littlefinger and the Tyrells have actually done is taken out a murder contract on the bridegroom, all without making a word of it explicit. And that is politics, baby.
You were talking about this, about Littlefinger being the kind of the gangster type figure and, plotting a criminal deal, like a political mastermind, a criminal enterprise in the guise of a wedding is something that is very prevalent in certain gangster movies and stuff like that. So I think that's brilliantly said. I think we come in, but the interesting thing about it though is that how much of this is actually true to what occurs at Bitterbridge? Like you were saying, there's that aspect of that unreliable narrator, which is a big, big part of Littlefinger, and that he's always playing multiple games at the same time, always having multiple things occurring at the same time, and often not telling the truth, rarely telling the truth, never telling the truth. So I honestly think, and this is one of those rare occasions that I think Littlefinger is telling the truth, because what Littlefinger does with Sansa in A Storm of Swords is that he's not there to kind of impart a lesson to her or attempt to boost himself up. He's bragging. He's bragging about what a brilliant fucking political mastermind he was in order to make this all come together. And I think that's ultimately Littlefinger's downfall, is his hubris, his arrogance, his desire to monologue. Caught me monologuing, as the villain from The Incredibles said. That's Littlefinger. Always, I imagine that he's being led to the block in Winterfell. He's going to be monologuing about how he had done all these wonderful things his entire life, and right before the axe or the sword comes down across his neck. That's really a powerful part of Littlefinger's character and story and characterization, in that he has a weakness. We've talked a lot about Tyrion's weaknesses here, his blind spots. Littlefinger has blind spots too. His blind spot is the form of Sansa Stark. That is the one piece who is coming into a mind of her own in A Feast for Crows, is becoming much more into a mind of her own, as we see in the sample chapter from The Winds of Winter. And it makes perfect sense. But I think here we see Littlefinger at his best game. This is a brilliant, cynical, utterly fucked up, wicked thing that Littlefinger does, and it's great. It's so much fun to actually get in the mind of Littlefinger and see what happens. And I think the one aspect I'll say before I close out is that I love the fact that George leaves this off page in A Clash of Kings, and we have to wait to A Storm of Swords to actually get the backstory of what occurs in this space of those 35-ish chapters that go between this chapter and when Littlefinger shows back up in King's Landing at the end of A Clash of Kings and Sansa's final chapter. It's great. I love it. It's a great way that George writes A Song of Ice and Fire, and that he fills in the details post facto and makes us kind of go like, oh, now it all makes sense. It's good. I love it.
Well, it's how you really keep track of a person like Littlefinger. You're not always going to be able to know what powerful people are doing all the time. You only know the information they give you. And even then, you can only trust that Littlefinger's telling you the truth. I agree with you. He probably is in this case because he's trying to get Sansa to see these connections. But maybe he's overstating the fact. Maybe he's describing some things he wished he had done. There's no reason to tell all the truth all the time. So it's always going to be a shadow on a wall.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think that about wraps us up for this analysis of A Clash of Kings Tyrion 8. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you to those of you who are watching this live stream. We will, of course, stick around as we often do, always do, in answering questions and chatting with you guys a little bit afterwards, so stick around for a little bit longer. If you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, and Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcasts.
Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIAF. Follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF, or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at PoorQuentin on Twitter or at PoorQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beefish on Twitter, Brendan Beefish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon: Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Nurble, the Shoeless Sage, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfwood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys and Lady of Jameson, Lady Britt, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Sir Tim the Knight who was guided by voices, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way of Course, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore, Lord Mark Connington, heir to Griffin's Roost, Lord Sam Kay, Sir Michael Mertens, Wisdom Benjicut, Alchemist of Setson Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Boolin de Morgan, Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping, Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, Septon Merriful Head of Hair, Lady Silverwing, and our newest High Lords, Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State, and Kabath the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light. So thank you so much to all our High Lords and ladies.
Yeah, thank you folks very, very much, and welcome to Joe Snow and Kaboth. Excellent question, Kaboth. We'll feature the second part of your question next week, as we will be sailing back to the north for Theon 3, in which our hero commits a bunch of war crimes, then comes up with a crazy-ass plan to take Winterfell with a handful of his Ironborn bros. Gosh, thank God that this is never going to work out, because Theon's just a fucking idiot, right? Right?
Sadly, this is one of the long shot plans that actually works, or it works just long enough for Theon to screw himself over. Theon's storyline in A Clash of Kings is, an ongoing cyclone of terrible decisions, and Theon 3 just makes everything worse.
Cannot wait for that chapter. I can't actually wait for that chapter. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to you all who have been watching us on our live streams. And thank you to our patrons. And we will see you guys sometime, some of y'all literally next week. All right.
Excellent. Thanks for sticking around, folks, as always. Hope you liked it.
I liked it. I thought you were excellent.
That's all that counts. I don't actually care what they think.
It's same.
It's irrelevant.
I
agree.
This chapter, I mean, it's I always find it just I mean, I love doing these episodes with you, obviously, but I always find it just like fascinating how we can like turn like a page that's a chapter that's like 4 or 5 pages and turn it into like a 25-page document and analyzing it. It's great. It's great.
I mean, we've just gotten more adept at it, and the chapters themselves are getting so dense, and they're just building on everything that came before. So it's just, it has that in common with like kind of academic research, like the stereotype of academic research is that's like 80 footnotes a page per paragraph of actual text. Mm-hmm. We get into that kind of layers. I imagine that's going to be us by the time we get to like Feast and Dance. We'll be like Gandalf in a dusty old library surrounded by all the papers, just working back through our own canon.
You were talking about the Asha fragment, which is like all of what 3 or 4 sentences that were found like on a computer screen, and how many pages of analysis and videos have been made about those.
The sacred Jedi texts, it's all we got, so we work with it. It is a religious thing in a deeply embarrassing way.
And we should talk about the something that was really cool that came out today. Before we answer you guys' questions, we appreciate them. I'm looking at them as we're going through. Is that there's a friend of mine, one of the fellow moderators for the Song of Ice and Fire subreddit, Zionist, whatever his name is actually, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Came with a really cool catch that in the early draft of A Feast for Crows, Cersei 3, Sir Boros Blunt actually dies in the chapter, and then George rewrote that so that Sir Boros Blunt does not die in the chapter. But at the end of the Dance of Dragons prologue, sort of Boros ain't looking so good, is he?
He's probably gonna go. Yep.
It's so sad that Boros Blunt.
Culture.
We're all very sad. As sad as we were about Renly at the start of this episode. So, anyways, so check out that. I'll try and find the link and post it in the comments there if you want to take a look at that post, because it's a really, really good post. All right, first question from our friend Joe Magician, who asks, in Nauticast, who is Varis and who is Littlefinger?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't think either of us want to be Littlefinger.
But who is it if you had to choose?
I guess probably me. I suppose. No?
I don't know. You're like the more analytical. You're like the long-term one. Like I function on chaos.
But I look more like him, and I'm sleazier, so I feel like it has to be me. I don't think either of us are appropriate for that particular role.
Is this a comment on me balding? Because I'm balding back here. You can't see it.
Not in the least. Never.
That's why I'm Varis.
You can be Varis and I'll be Illyrio. They get along. How about that? That sounds fun.
There you go.
I love hanging out in Pentos and just eating cheese all day. That sounds just great.
Yeah.
Great. Sign me up.
Sounds delicious. Okay. People are saying that you look like Littlefinger. Come on, he has a real goatee. He doesn't have a little chin. I had one in my school.
Slightly more handsome, but I don't dress as old as Littlefinger.
That's true.
I will absolutely grant him that.
David Blackfire asks, "What do you think is going on with Loras and his injury on Dragonstone?"
We always have. No one knows with this one. He's probably. It's probably a Jaime lost his hand thing, probably, given how Loras is compared with Jaime, and he's probably going to suffer and come at it in a new person and a new, yada, yada, yada. I sound very cynical and glib about this. It's just there's so little information to work with when it comes to Loras on Dragonstone. All we can do is speculate. Yeah,
I agree. There's nothing really just beyond like the whisperings of those 2 septas that are escorting Cersei to the High Sparrow. Which like, and then the Queen's brother. And it's referred, it's Loras they're talking about, but they don't go into any detail, which of course means that George has something planned, or he doesn't have something planned. And it's like, I'll just drop this line in here and they'll figure out later on down the road, which seems like
a
George thing to say. There's a bunch of questions early on. Let me find one from a bit before. If you have posted a question before, it looks like I'm not able to scroll up past a certain time, so feel free to repost your question. Okay. Big Mac asks, how would you compare the upbringing of the Stark children versus the Tyrell children? Both have loving relationships with each other, but sometimes the Tyrells seem more equipped for the real world. We talked about this in some of the Sansa chapters from Game of Thrones. I think you had some really good points about that when we were covering that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, a lot of it is speculation because we don't have a direct POV. And the Tyrells, they do seem to function more as a unit, and none of them seem particularly, burdened with crippling insecurities or a lack of awarenesses about the real world. Ned just had a very, very different Robert's Rebellion than Mace Tyrell is the thing, and lost a lot more. And this resulted in kind of like a desperate control freak attitude about keeping the children safe and home and kind of in a bubble about a lot of things. And Jon is also just kind of, the fly in the ointment, preventing a certain amount of family unity here that the Tyrells didn't have to do with. The Tyrells are not angels by any measure, but they also just had a lot of burdens other families have, unique burdens that the Tyrells just didn't have to deal with. I think that just made it easier.
Yeah, I agree. I think so much in feudal politics revolves around the personal nature of the ruler and what the type of rule is going to be felt by the people there, to include the ruler's children. And we see that in Ned Stark, and that he, like you were saying, he's very much animated by his the sadness he feels over Lyanna and the losses he experienced during the war of during Robert's Rebellion. So Mace Tyrell really didn't suffer at all, right? He didn't lose a single person on the battlefield, didn't lose any children, didn't lose a sister, father, an uncle. I mean, no one close to him died. So he's a pretty amiable guy, all things considered.
Mace Tyrell didn't lose anything. Mace Tyrell gained several pounds in Robert's Rebellion.
Yeah.
More of Mace Tyrell afterwards. That's what happened to him. Yeah. So
Right.
it's, it's a lark for him. He didn't have to bring that down on his kids. He was able to again, Mace Tyrell screwed up in certain regards, like pushing Willis to tournaments too early. But I think there was not this fraught gauntlet awaiting them that there was for the Starks.
Mm-hmm. Agreed there. Liam says, starting Fever Dream for the first time tonight. Can't wait. Well, we were just talking about that right before we came on air. Actually, even before we did our mini episode, and we're excited. We're going to do our ninth chapter, right? We're recording that next week. Do you guys? We talked about this last week. Do you guys want to actually see that as a live episode? I mean, we understand that people might not be as interested in Fever Dream material. We might only get like 20 people watching, but it is
shorter, so don't show up expecting a monolith. But yeah, that could be fun.
Yeah, we'll see. If you guys want to see that, just let us know. Shoot us a line, email, Twitter, Patreon, whatever you want to do.
Semaphore, smoke signals.
Yeah, use the smoke signals. Okay, so Guilty Undertaker asks, the Tyrells didn't seem fully committed to killing Joffrey until dinner with Sansa. What would Littlefinger have done if they'd gotten cold feet?
That's a good question.
They still had Loras that was going to be joining the Kingsguard, and Joffrey wouldn't have been able to contain his sadistic urges, right? So it still works out.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. If they got cold feet, it would be because they don't think Joffrey is enough of a danger to provoke Loras. You know what I mean? Like, that's the only way that the situation would go down. If they determined that Joffrey was not that bad of a danger, then they would think, okay, maybe we can get away with this. As for what Littlefinger does at that point, like, it's trying to keep the timeline in mind here. So Sansa has not been wed to Tyrion yet.
Right.
So maybe the Tyrells would still try to claim her for Willis, and I'm not sure how Littlefinger would get Sansa away to himself without the purple wedding as a cover. So that would be Littlefinger's next move. I'm not sure how he would solve that. What do you think?
As it stands for a lot of these AUs, like, and not that I think that they're bad, I just think that the story is the story is, so I think Littlefinger was always intended to succeed at least at this point in the story, to bring the Tyrells into alliance with the Lannisters in order to, of course, kill Joffrey. And Sansa was always intended to be the person to confirm what Littlefinger's agents were spreading, the tales that they were spreading in the Tyrell camp at Bitterbridge. So I'm not saying that hypotheticals are bad. Hypotheticals are great. You should be engaging in hypotheticals in your own writing, especially as you guys are developing your own narratives and fiction stories about how you would proceed forward. As we all know, that George has done basically the same thing in hypotheticals in the famous case of Quentin's marriage to Dany's marriage to Aester's Oloric, when it would actually occur. And when Quentin would arrive, he wrote 3 different versions of that scene to determine which one had the most narrative poignancy. And he ended up determining that Quentin arrives the day before Dany weds his daughter. So not a bad thing. It's just something that I'm always like, and I can see it in your face too. You're like, well, yeah, maybe Littlefinger does this. Well, it would, yeah. The story would be the story that we got as it stands right now. So, not a bad question. Just for me, hypotheticals are not. So I think it's something that animates me as a passion. But that's fine. That's fine. Live your life. It's America. Eric R. asks, is Tywin really that intimidating to his children that no one decided to call him out for never remarrying while he forces marriages on them? Yes.
Sure. I mean, calling him out in the sense
I'm not sure the hypocrisy of like forcing like Cersei to get married and Tyrion to get married, and while he himself has remained unwed.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what obligation Tywin has to get married. It's not like he's really going to be producing more kids. I guess, if the argument is he needs another heir, sure, but he has Jaime in mind for that. With Cersei, it's the specific case he's making that you need to have children by a husband to make Stannis look like a liar.
Right.
I'm not sure how accurate that is. The honest answer is that Tywin just likes controlling everyone else's sexuality. And I think that's really the problem. I don't think it's hypocrisy really that bothers me there. Like, I don't really care whether Tywin gets married or not. I just wish he was less of an asshole about his kids.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, Tywin's hypocrisy is a big part of his personality, but I think that he did have some political motivations in order to bring the Tyrells into a life. The weird thing, though, for me, is that the first person that Tywin suggests that Cersei marry is Willis, but he's already has the Tyrell alliance established with Joffrey marrying Marjorie, which has already been. He doesn't know it's going to end, very sadly. But I don't know. But yeah, I think that Tywin never remarrying is an interesting aspect of the storyline that I think maybe might get more exploration come the Winds of Winter. Perhaps we'll see. I'm not sure.
But I mean, is there really any advantage to him? Like, I'm just curious. Like, what's the case for doing it? Like, he's not going to have another kid, right? I mean is it just like causing? Because like I get, marriage pacts, make these alliances strong, but doesn't it have to come down to like having a kid at some point? Is he going to marry like a childless widow and just live in? Like, there's not what the political benefit of Tywin marrying again is really.
So it's like Roderick Cassell, you like perform like the Roderick Cassell role in marrying Lady Hornwood or something like that.
Right, that's a good point. But like who? But
who would be the person, right?
Who's the woman, right? Exactly. That's what I'm saying. I'm not sure what that role would be. Anyway, moving on.
Lysa. He would marry Lysa. There you go.
There you go. Great point. Actually, that's a great point. That's something Cersei and Tyrion just said. Why don't you marry Lysa? That's a very good point. That would have been an interesting conversation to witness.
It sure would. All right, Rohane L, who is someone who's been animating a lot of our discussion in the chat section. Appreciate you tuning in and chatting always. Asks, do you think Olenna motivates the Tyrells' more sleazy schemes or is moving them in a positive direction? Not positive as in helping them gain power.
I don't know. I mean, the Red Wines, if anything, they're kind of sleazier than the Tyrells, really, ain't they? I think Olenna is definitely shrewder about how to manipulate intelligence in other people than I think Mace or Loras is. I don't think she is necessarily more elevated in her politics. She's, like how she talks to Alleria Sand or how quickly they drop Sansa like a hot potato. I think smarter does not mean classier, I would say.
So you would tend to lean more towards the sleazy side of things and the pushing the Tyrells toward being the noble good guys in the story.
I think if anyone's doing that, it's probably Willis, who's just doing that by like staying at home and tending to his garden and like, chickadees from his hand or whatever it is Willis does all day.
It sounds like a great life. I would like that life.
Not bad.
All right. SKNCS, how long will Sam's misadventures at Hogwarts last before Cthulhu destroys Old Town?
Yeah, that's the question in Old Town, is because, I think Euron's heading to town and it doesn't look good for the city once he gets there. But Sam has to get up to some shenanigans first. I imagine, he's been there a bit. I imagine when we get to Sam and the Winds of Winter, we will cut to like he's been there for months and we'll just catch up on what has been going on. And we probably won't spend that much time, I think, with him doing actual Citadel duties. We'll just like hear about what he's been doing because there's a lot of specifics. He has to deal with the faceless man who's calling himself Pate and the High Towers and all that shenanigans to get on with. So I don't think Sam doing direct Citadel stuff is going to get a lot of time. I think it's just going to be mentioned as him having done some.
That's just like I agree with you. I think it might be like 2 chapters, maybe tops, before Euron's coming to Old Town. And then we would then it goes up in flames. But I think it's an interesting side that seems unexplored in A Song of Ice and Fire, like the education of someone at the Citadel. We only get the prologue chapter from Feast of Crows and Samuel's final chapter in Feast. We don't really see much more else of what the education structure is like in Westeros. It seems like something that could be explored that George might dedicate significant amounts of page space to. But as of I don't know, a few years ago, I don't think George had written any Samwell material since A Feast for Crows, so it doesn't seem to be animating him the same way that Bravos has just somehow captured this man's mind in writing A Song of Ice and Fire and writing hundreds and hundreds of pages of his adventures.
Well, yeah, Sam learning stuff makes things concrete, and George likes keeping things ambiguous and mysterious, so maybe that's not what he likes, really.
Yeah. True. All right, Kayleen asks, what do you think George R. Martin is trying to say by framing Stannis' story from women's point of views and contextualizing it in terms of gendered violence? That is, burning of Shireen, Sansa and Kat, and Selyse.
I mean, that's definitely a part of it. I mean, the major POVs on Stannis are men, Davos and Jon.
Mm-hmm.
And Stannis' kind of, social bonds with other men are kind of the primary drive of his story, but there's definitely a huge aspect of his story where he just, as Asha and Carson say about him, he just doesn't understand women and seems to think of them as this other species. And this completely undercuts the idea that he's going to be, a just king for everybody. He's going to, bind the realm into a unitary good whole through his service. because there's just half the species he just doesn't regard regard at all
as human.
And so I think that that does say something about there's the idea that giving up Shireen is giving up the thing he loves most, as Melisandre has framed as the overall Azor Ahai framework sets it up as. But if he's being very cold towards all the women in his life, how much love is really there for that? And that is something I think that needs to be addressed, because that is a contradiction as it stands.
Do you think there isn't a component of gender violence in how Stannis treats women specifically in the narrative? I mean, we have not seen the burning of Shireen and Song of Ice and Fire yet, but I'm trying to think specifically of what he does towards women.
I mean, he punishes rapists more actively than many military leaders in the series do. I don't think that's really about sticking up for women so much as more the rules say so. And I always come back to how heinously he talks about Gilly.
Yeah.
And just how little sympathy he shows there. So yeah, I just think Stannis has difficulty treating anyone else as a human being, but especially women.
Yeah, I agree there.
It's not like he's nice to men, but it's worse for women.
Yeah. I mean, to see I don't know. This is I keep throwing these questions to you. I'm taking away from the people who are actually asking us questions. But do you think he's better than his peers in his treatment of women and treatment of? I mean, you talked about this as the treatment of rapists in the army, but
sure. I mean, it depends. Compare him to Robert. He was never physically abusive to Selyse, but emotionally, mentally, he might have been worse.
Yeah.
Just living with Stannis is a nightmare, and he chooses to make it that way, and he especially chooses to make it that way for women. And I don't think it's not this you have Chet in the prologue to A Storm of Swords, and just this seething misogyny and hatred of all women and all men who remind him of women. And I don't think Stannis is quite there, but it's just, I think a lot of it is that he just he saw Robert's sexuality and felt just so different from that. Now he looks at women and thinks, oh, Robert probably would want you naked. Weird. And I think that's just his mindset.
Yeah, agreed there. Yeah, I like that. Sorry. I started to get on tangents from you guys' questions, but Stannis is always a topic for lots of thought and discussion. And I always like to plug your mind for all the depths that I can plug out of it. All right. ASOF Geek U asks, who are your favorite minor characters who appear in only 1 or 2 scenes?
Well, we mentioned Courtney Penrose. He's a great one. He's coming up soon. We're doing Dagmar Cleftjaw next week in Theon 3. He only shows up once. Marwyn the Mage is only once so far. He's pretty awesome. Widow of the Waterfront. There's a lot of great ones.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of ones that show up for a moment. I mean, a couple of those wildlings that show up when they're coming south of the wall.
Sure, a lot of fun ones. Yeah, Wyla Manderley only shows up once.
Wyla, that's true. Yeah, Wyla up there as well.
Bless her.
Yeah, she'll show up in the Winds Winter, I'm sure. She'll have a little.
Oh yeah, a lot of them will come back. These are just one-off so far. Courtney Penrose obviously is rather permanently a one-off since he's dead.
Okay, this is probably the question of the night, in my opinion. Samir asks, Stannis, more or less of a misogynist than Cersei?
I don't know. Cersei's going for the all-time gold medal in that one. Ranking different kinds of misogyny is pointless, but there's the internalized misogyny of Cersei. There's a certain intimacy and self-loathing quality to it that makes it burn hotter than Stannis. I don't know if it's more or less, but for Cersei, it's more personal. She would like to personally murder all other women, please, right now. Form a line, all other women. So Cersei can personally murder you. With Stannis, it's just more you have different parts than me. It's more juvenile, but I think it's less important.
I think a part about it being juvenile is very important because it all stems from childhood trauma for Stannis.
Absolutely.
This childhood relationship to Robert. And we know that Robert was getting it on at a very early age and Stannis was not. I mean, we see people like that in the real world who.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to make it all about the fact that I'm going to be catching up sexually for the rest of my life. I know those guys.
Right.
I think we've all met those guys, and they just, it's unfortunate that Stannis can't see, hey, all that sex didn't make Robert happy, except in maybe in the moment, but orgasm lasts 5 seconds, Stannis. Calm down. It didn't actually make Robert that happy. He's completely empty still. What were you missing out on? Really, dude?
Yeah. Kelly makes a good point that I think Stannis is just woefully incapable of seeing women as people. Yeah, I mean, we see this really strongly from his interactions with Asha Greyjoy in A Dance with Dragons, and every single interaction he has with Selyse. It's stop clutching at me, woman. It's in A Storm of Swords. It's well, she's your wife. That's not the way you treat another human being. It's definitely not the way you treat your wife. So it's just.
Oh, for sure. And again, I think Stannis genuinely wants everyone away from him at all times. It's, he's not hanging out with men and smiling to them and then frowning at women, but there is just a lack of comprehension he has.
Yeah.
Towards why women and we know men like this in real life who look at a woman and see like a worse version of a man and think, well, you're just broken and imperfect, and those men exist, and it's horrible to witness.
Mm-hmm. Who's worse, Tywin or Stannis, in terms of being a misogynist? We're getting a lot of these like either or questions. I'm going to go with Tywin, very strongly Tywin, over Stannis, at least in this case, given his horrendous treatment of Tysha.
Sure, yeah, that's definitely, but these all these intersecting layers, because obviously Tysha was, what happened to her was very gendered, but so much of that is about class more than anything else with Tywin in terms of enforcing that hierarchy. And Stannis, I don't think, is particularly as invested in that divide. But also, I think, like, a given woman of a noble class would have a much easier time talking to Tywin than talking to Stannis. Like, the way Jenna describes Tywin, like the hero who stood up for me, when I was a little girl. No one describes Stannis that way. No woman describes Stannis that way or ever will. So both are bad in this regard, but I think there's some like different intersecting layers of power that are going on with these two that make them different flavors of bad in this regard.
Yeah, I think you're right about it. I think that there's an aspect for Tywin where there is a definite gender side of it, but there's also like the power dynamics at play and also class dynamics. So you talked about the class dynamics. I'll talk about the power dynamics with the way that Alayaya is beaten by Tywin. And that stems primarily from Tywin's extreme shame at his father Tydeus' behavior in bringing a woman who is not his wife into Casterly Rock, and him feeling absolutely just mortified by this fact. Again, that intersects with class, as you were talking about before. But the power dynamic means for him is that Tyrion is showing himself to be as weak as his father, and so there's power and class going on at the same time. All right, let's spoil a Clash of Kings Tyrion 14 with this question from definitely not a spy for the Blackfires, Clint, who asks, who sent Manded Moore?
I lean Joffrey on the whole, just because otherwise Tyrion slapping him at King's Landing leads to nothing. And because Cersei's a POV, we don't get any hint from her. I get that Littlefinger also has a thing for Tyrion a reason to take Tyrion down at this point, but I've never bought any connection between Manded Moore and Littlefinger.
Okay, so they're both from the Vale. There's one. They both came
that narrows it down. True.
Well, I mean, how many other Vale Knights are Kingsguard members or bearing the white cloak at this point?
No, that's true. That's true.
They both came to King's Landing around the same time, seemingly. Manded Moore has no friends. His sword is his only thing. I mean, in my opinion, I maybe Joffrey. I think
sound like the kind of guy who hangs out with Littlefinger, the kind of guy whose only friend is duty and worships their sword. Littlefinger likes people who fuck and drink and have indulgences he can prey upon and blackmail and bribe. What does he have on Manded Moore?
Well, he also has the fact that Tyrion has insulted Manded Moore in his first chapter, right? Basically threatens him. That's true. Also, add in too, remember how Tyrion threatens Manded Moore in that chapter, and that he tells, the only reason I'm like bringing this up is because I reread the theory about this somewhat recently, like, within the past couple of days, that he threatens, Tyrion threatens Manded Moore with Bronn, saying that, oh yeah, this guy, you remember the captain of the guards for John Arryn? Well, actually,
Varis and Littlefinger, right?
Varis and Littlefinger, yeah, that major character. There's a character that has a single scene that
sure,
yeah,
very true.
And Manded Moore says, "Yes, I knew him." It's like, yeah, this guy killed him. So there is a motivation angle there, and that Tyrion has dishonored Manded Moore, who seemingly has only motivated by honor and by his sword. There's the personal aspect. If Manded Moore didn't have any friends, but at least he knew the one guy that Tyrion threatens him with, and they're both from the Vale. Case closed.
I suppose I still don't quite buy that causal connection between Littlefinger and Manded Moore, and I'm not sure why Littlefinger would then stop trying to kill Tyrion at that point, if indeed he does. I mean, I guess because he's not planning on framing him for the Purple Wedding. That might be what he ultimately switches over to. So I could see that working out. I just never quite bought the connection between the two. And I just think, for me, it's easier for me to buy the connection between Joffrey and one of his Kingsguard, because that connection is quite direct.
Yeah,
he just gives the order. And then Joffrey might have been, kind of been cowed after that, but when Tywin shows up. But I'll definitely have to keep an eye when we get closer to the Blackwater about any more hints in this regard, because it is a fun mystery.
Absolutely. All right, we got a Dany question. We're always getting Dany questions. Micmac asks, does Dany have to die for a Song of Ice and Fire to have a satisfying ending? Worst case scenario, I'd want her to die a hero. P.S. Tyrion conspiring to kill her, makes him a piece of shit undeserving of being anyone's hand. Does it have to be satisfying for Dany to die? Does the Song of Ice and Fire have to be satisfying for Dany to die?
I mean, I don't know about have to. I think if it's built into the structure of her story well and tragically, then I think it works. I don't think have to is a really concern here, because I think it all depends on execution. I think you could execute it well or poorly. I think the show kind of rushed a lot of it, but I think the structure works overall. I think Tyrion conspiring to kill her with the vague plan of putting Jon in her place, and with him having been on board this whole way, I don't think it makes Tyrion look like a piece of shit. I think it makes him look very confused, which is what we got into when we were talking about season 8. It makes him look like he really doesn't know what he's doing anymore. Mm-hmm. I think it makes him look inconsistent more than evil. And I think that's a problem of the writing more than of Tyrion's decision making, because I think in the books, Tyrion is going to be urging on Dany's worst instincts, and if he gets horrified, it will be after he's already helped her do terrible things, and he will be like, "Oh shit, what did I do?"
Yeah,
which I don't think that is meant to make Tyrion look good, that particular structure. But I mean, even within the context of the show, like, I mean, yeah, she did blow up a city. Like, don't we praise the guy Carlton Chelsted, who wouldn't be Aerys's hand anymore?
Yeah,
he was planning on doing that. Should we not? Is it not good for Tyrion to, I think the show executed this in such a way which was trying to make Tyrion look much better than he is. So I don't approve of that. But I applaud people who are working in government situations who are willing to turn against their leader once their leader does terrible things. Just in the abstract, I think that's a good thing.
In the abstract, I agree. It is a good thing. I think, again, the execution is something that was a little bit lacking in season 8, but I do think that there was a fair amount of groundwork that was laid for the action. And I think there's a great essay that I recommend everyone read called Daughter of Death by our friend Eliana, aka Glass Table Girl from the Girls Gone Canon podcast, in which she talked about how Dany's story is specifically structured as a Shakespearean tragedy, which will ultimately culminate in her death. And for me, that means, for me personally, and I can't speak for everyone, but that means that her dying is a satisfying conclusion to her arc and her story, because we might be sad about Dany dying, about someone turning to blowing up cities at the end of her arc and then A Song of Ice and Fire. And that's a horrifying kind of twist, but it's one that George has embedded in the narrative, starting all the way back into Game of Thrones and building it up successively through the storylines. We could close A Dance with Dragons and get into a much more violent where Dany has a much more violent conception of what is going to animate her rule going forward. Rule by dragons. Dragons plant no trees. These are all pushing towards that direction. So, it's everyone's personal enjoyment or opinion about satisfaction of whether something is a satisfactory ending is going to vary from person to person to person. But in the context of evaluating Dany's story as a tragedy, I think it will be a satisfying ending. I think it was less satisfying in the show than it will be in the books. But that kind of goes for every single ending, comparing the unpublished books, which we assume are going to be amazing and awesome, versus the show, which has been in the can now for over a year at this point.
And, I also think, I walk around, I see buildings after Harry S. Truman, who ordered two cities disintegrated. You can argue about the morality of why he did it, but he did it. Mm-hmm. And we have busts to the man. So I sometimes I wonder whether we're kidding ourselves about thinking this is just horrific, that someone who people would adore and has done good things and is a leader of people would blow up cities. Unfortunately, that happens. Mm-hmm. We did it. Here we still are as America, loving ourselves and living our lives. The nation that blew up cities because we thought we had a good reason to. Here we are. So we live with that.
And again, it's always the point that's in real life and in Song of Ice and Fire too, and that someone who can deploy 2 nuclear weapons to destroy cities can also do things like desegregate the army, like it's people are just not one coin bad or the other coin really, really good. People are complex, and there's
Especially people in power, their complexities are just bigger than the rest of us.
And Dany is a super. Yes, Dany's one of the most is perhaps George's most complex characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I love George for writing her that way.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Sir Frank B asks, how do we think the Tyrells, especially Garland, reacted to Loras murdering 3 knights in cold blood? Had he ever done anything like that before? Did it shock them? What about their image campaign?
That's a good question from Frank there. Yeah, I mean, this generation, the Tyrells hasn't done any real fighting. I mean, they're used to like little tricks and gambits and tourney moves. I imagine probably the death of Renly overshadowed things to a certain extent here.
Mm-hmm.
It can't hurt that the men he killed were a Stormlander and a guy from the Vale, respectively.
Yeah.
No one the Tyrells particularly know or were friends with or care about very much. I think that probably helped.
I agree, and I think there's also the component of chaos too, which is going in with Renly's death, as we see from the end of Catelyn's 4th chapter, how the entire army is just kind of going nuts after they learned about Renly's death, and it's kind of like spreading out amongst the army camp. So 3 more deaths, well, it doesn't really mean a whole lot ultimately, and can be quite easily papered over by the Tyrells, who again are masters of image politics. But did Garland react to Loras murdering 3 knights? I don't know. Do you think Loras went to Garland at some point at Bitterridge and was like, hey, listen, bro, I did something bad,
I can see it.
Real bad.
That's a great point. I can imagine that scene. Garland seems to be one of the more, if not genuinely good-hearted people in the series, certainly someone who's more open to having these kind of personal discussions he does with Tyrion and Sansa. So I could absolutely see that happening.
I agree. And I'm wondering if there's going to be more fallout from that in the Winds of Winter, since we are likely going to be encountering the Royces again in Sansa's storyline, and we'll see what happens. What Big Daddy Royce thinks of his son dying at the hands of Loras Tyrell. All right. SKNC asks, if Ashara is Gianna Reed, why did she fake her death?
Well, this is Chloe from Girls Gone Canon's big, great theory, of course. So she's the one to ask, really. But because anyone involved in the whole R plus L equals J scheme is basically in danger from Robert at this point. I think it's a lot of the reason, and all of this stuff was hidden, and why no one can talk to Wyla about any of this information. It's why Howland Reed himself probably hasn't left the Neck. I mean, generally the people of the Neck are kind of isolated and keep to themselves. But it's also why Ned has kept to himself in Winterfell in large part, because everyone's just trying to hold on to this conspiracy, and because it wouldn't really honestly take that much for Robert to figure this out. So I think if this theory is true, I think that's why the Danes and the Reeds and the Starks are keeping as much under the surface as they possibly can to keep anyone from following this breadcrumb trail to Jon Snow.
But do you think it matters after Robert is dead that she stays hidden? I mean, why would she want to stay hidden in the Neck after Robert is gone? Stannis is disinherited. All the people who could potentially harm, I guess not all the people who would potentially harm her are gone, right? Because then you have the Boltons and the Freys, who obviously take a huge stake in preventing the rise of any potential alternate forms of power from rising up. So I guess I answered my own question, but
I mean, or just if again, if theory is true, she's been living in the Neck for years, then that's her life now, and that's her family now, and maybe she wakes up in the morning and thinks of herself as Gianna before Ashara. Who knows? You become the mask eventually if you wear it long enough.
Yeah, that's true. Very, very true. I will take a few more questions here. We really appreciate everyone sticking around. 73 people are still watching at 10:44 Eastern Standard Time, Freedom Standard Time, as I like to call it. And we really appreciate you. All right, Matilda D asks, what do you think it says that George R. R. Martin only reveals mysteries, if at all, long after the fact, and rarely to the characters who want to know them most? Could some major mysteries go forever unsolved?
Major mysteries, I'm not sure. I mean, certain things, I could definitely see being left ambiguous, like, Tyrion's heritage, maybe even young Griff's heritage. What do you think?
The major thing that comes to my mind is the Littlefinger and Lysa talking about who killed Jon Arryn in A Storm of Swords in the Vale as being the major mystery that ends up being revealed to Sansa, who has really no stake in who killed Jon Arryn.
Sure.
A lot of it feels like we were talking about this about this in Tyrion's 6th chapter, which is of course the episode I re-listened to today. So that's why it's most on my mind before we came into recording this one. But it feels like the reveals that Pycelle has about how it was he who had ordered the gates, who counseled Aerys to open the gates. It feels more like a nod to readers as opposed to something that's direct.
There's a lot of that, yeah.
Which is fine. I mean, it's a way that George writes the novels that makes sense. But I think I think like the major ones that are left to be revealed, the major one is obviously going to be R plus L equals J. And I do think that Jon is going to have to find this out at some point, whether it's through Bram or through Sam or through both at the same time, as the show put it. It's going to have an impact on him as a character. So I think George saves these major reveals. This major reveal, which I think is the pinnacle of A Song of Ice and Fire in terms of like mysteries and the revelation of mysteries, it'll be specifically revealed to Jon to have the largest and most profound narrative impact on Jon as a character moving forward, post life, post death, post King of the North, whatever he's actually is at that point when it's revealed to him. All right, I'll take two more, let's say.
Sure.
Liam asks, are there any point of views you wish George included in the story so far?
I mean, a Tyrell would be interesting. It's probably a lot of information we don't really need, and it's probably better off, left outside the corner of our eyes. But yeah, a Marjorie POV, I think that could be fascinating. I would love more from a Wildling POV too, and from someone in the East, that from those people there, it might feel tacked on. I always say, it'd be better if George, expanded the Dothraki or the Giscari. Then I think, well, I don't really like what he's done with them so far that much, by comparison to a lot of other stuff in the series. So maybe if he did more with them, it would be that good. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before about the having Missandei as the point of view for Meereen, which might be interesting to give the perspective of the of Dany's children, those who've been freed from slavery. I think that would probably do a lot of good for the narrative. It's not something that George will likely opt for because he has Barristan as acting as the point of view for what's going on within Meereen at this time, and we'll see. But some people are talking about Robb. We talk about Robb specifically for Tyrion 5. Is that the one we talked about that, or we talked about that in another?
I'm not sure which one, but yeah, we talked about that. Whether Robb should have been a POV. I really don't think he should. I'm fine with him not being one. Yeah. I think a POV on his campaign would have been great, but he himself, I like it that the Kings are for the most part kept away from us in that regard.
Yeah, I remember you talked about Mage Mormont being a point of view, which would have been really cool. And
I think AC Mormont is the one I would love
AC
to see.
Mormont, sorry, yep.
Anyone in that campaign would have been great, yeah.
Yep. All right, last question of the night. All right, excellent question to finish us off tonight. Micmac asks, in your estimation, does Game of Thrones belong in the pantheon of greatest TV series of all time? Why or why not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the amount of moments and scenes and whole episodes, and we talk about things not being satisfying at the ending or being rushed, but that's relative to the books or the show we wanted in our heads. Relative to other TV shows, yeah, it's still head and shoulders above 95% of them. I mean, most shows, like most things, suck. I mean, you start listing a couple of the great shows, and everyone agrees on a dozen or so, and then you start getting into little niches and individual cult classics. But yeah, absolutely, I'd put Game of Thrones up there. I don't think it's as good as Better Call Saul or Twin Peaks or Deadwood, but it's not far below those.
I agree, and I think this is there's a couple of things to go in. There's the recency bias, which people are regarding Game of Thrones only through the lens of the final season of the show.
Sure.
But think about all of you guys who are listening. I guess you're watching because you're not listening because this part is not going to be part of the podcast. But all of you guys who are watching who came to A Song of Ice and Fire through the TV series, that's a massive accomplishment for a TV series to get people really motivated to read thousands of pages worth of material. I think that speaks to it being a great TV show that can inspire so much interest and fandom, and some of it's very annoying, even a year after Game of Thrones season 8 has ended. But I think it is still a part of the pantheon of the greatest TV series of all times. It's the moments, it's the characters, it's the filming, it's the acting, it's the music. Everything kind of comes together, and it makes it a really amazing, wonderful performance. Even if you might not like some of the episodes or some of the later seasons or whatever your opinion is about all of these things. Things have to be looked at in totality, not just as a look at one season and be like, nope, not the greatest show of all time, or not one of the great shows of all times. And I agree. There are shows that I prefer over Game of Thrones. There are great shows that I prefer over Game of Thrones that I think that totally botched the ending of it much more than Game of Thrones ever could possibly accomplish. I'm looking at you, Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined series from 2003 to 2008. It's okay. I mean, people are going to come in with a different perspective. That's okay. We all are a part of this big fandom family together as So many of you guys have gotten to participate in the virtual Ice and Fire Con, which was really fun. I got to watch some of the videos when I could. And that speaks a lot to Game of Thrones, that so many people are here in the fandom now as a result of this TV series, which started in 2011, ended last year. I think it does belong in the pantheon of the greatest TV series of all times.
And I think, that everything that went into it in terms of expectation and how the show changed over time is inextricable. The overall experience of Game of Thrones, I think, will stand the test of time, maybe even more than the show itself in isolation.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. So I think that about wraps us up for this live cast portion of our episode on A Clash of Kings Tier 8. Again, really appreciate all you guys sticking around, asking questions, chatting in there. It helps us in this our own personal long night here as we deal with the situation of the world as it stands, and you bring smiles to our faces, and try to keep Emmett awake here for another 5 seconds.
Oh, no. I mean, thank you so much, folks, for sticking around. It makes me very happy to answer questions with you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, makes us feel happy that you're so interested in the series and our opinions about the series. It's great. Thank you so much. So we will be back in a week for Clash of Kings Theon 3, and that'll also be live streamed. And we'll chat a little bit more about whether we'll do the Fever Dream episode, which we are tentatively planning right now for Friday the 8th is when we actually be recording that, same time, 8:30 p.m. So if you guys want to stick around for that, let us know, shoot us a message, and we'll see. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.